My name is Kendra, and I am 28 years old. My parents always called me the useless one while my brother won what they claimed was a full scholarship to Stanford University. On his graduation day, my father announced that my brother would inherit everything, including a $500,000 sports car and a luxury mansion. I sat there in silence, letting them mock my old clothes and my supposed failure of a life. They had no idea I was holding a check that was about to destroy their entire fake empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off the people who were supposed to protect you just to save yourself. The sharp crash of crystal shattering against marble echoed through the grand foyer. I stood frozen in the center of my parents' lavish Potomac mansion, while dark red wine dripped down the front of my only designer dress. The liquid stained the pale silk, soaking through to my skin and pooling at my feet. Laughter erupted around the room. It was not the polite chuckle of high society guests, but a cruel, coordinated mockery led by the two people who despised me most. My future sister-in-law Brianna stood in front of me holding the stem of her broken wine glass with an exaggerated expression of fake shock. "Oh my goodness, Kendra, I am so sorry," Brianna practically shouted, ensuring every doctor, lawyer, and socialite in the room turned to look at us. "Send me the dry cleaning bill, okay? I know you are really struggling down in that dark basement with your little coding hobby. Maybe you can write a program to wash clothes since you clearly cannot afford to buy new ones." Beside her, my younger brother Trevon let out a loud, arrogant laugh. He adjusted the cuffs of his custom-tailored suit and shook his head, looking at me like I was something he had scraped off the bottom of his expensive shoes. He took a sip of his champagne and leaned into Brianna, kissing her cheek while keeping his eyes fixed on my ruined dress. To understand how I ended up dripping with wine and humiliation, you have to know what happened exactly 30 minutes before I walked through those massive mahogany doors. The Maryland summer heat was suffocating when I pulled my battered 10-year-old Honda into the pristine neighborhood. Potomac is known for its sprawling estates and gated driveways, representing a physical manifestation of generational wealth and elite status. My parents, DeAndre and Valerie, built their entire identity around climbing this exact social ladder. They ran a real estate investment firm and obsessed over maintaining their image in their exclusive social clubs. Everything they did was a calculated performance designed to impress people who barely cared about them. As I approached the entrance to their street, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice did not hold a trace of warmth or welcome. It carried the sharp, frantic edge of someone terrified of losing face. "Kendra," she hissed through the speaker without even saying hello, "do not you dare pull that rusted piece of junk into the driveway. The caterers are here and the guests are arriving. We have Mercedes and Porsches lining the street. I am not having your embarrassing car ruin the aesthetic of the neighborhood. Park at the public lot 3 blocks down and walk." I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the familiar sting of rejection. For years, I was the family scapegoat, the constant disappointment who dropped out of a state college to teach myself software development. They saw my choice as a personal insult, a terrible stain on their carefully curated image of perfection. While they funded Trevon's luxurious lifestyle and bragged about his supposed academic achievements, they told their friends that I was a lost cause. They made sure I knew that my presence was a burden. I did not argue with her on the phone. I simply parked my car exactly where she demanded and walked 3 blocks in the sweltering humidity. With every step, my heels clicking on the hot pavement, I reminded myself why I was enduring this abuse. I carried a secret in my purse that made the humid walk entirely bearable. They thought I was a broke college dropout, struggling to write basic code in a basement. They had absolutely no idea that I was the anonymous founder of Aura Pay, a financial technology application that had just been valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. I had spent the last few years quietly building an empire while they spent their time tearing me down. When I finally reached the house, the party was in full swing. A live jazz band played softly on the back patio, filling the air with elegant melodies. Waiters in crisp white shirts carried silver trays of crab cakes and expensive champagne. My parents had pulled out all the stops to celebrate Trevon supposedly graduating with honors from Stanford. Trevon was the golden child, the boy who could do no wrong. He was loud, reckless, and completely dependent on my parents' money, but they worshipped the ground he walked on. They forgave his gambling habits, his failed business ventures, and his blatant disrespect because he fit the image of the handsome, successful son they desperately wanted to project. As I stepped into the foyer, trying to blend into the background, I watched my family work the room. They laughed, they clinked glasses, they played the role of the ultimate successful family. The air smelled of expensive floral arrangements and rich catered food. No one came to greet me. No one offered me a drink or asked how my walk was. I was merely tolerated an unfortunate obligation they felt forced to invite, just to avoid answering questions about my absence from the extended family. I stood near a massive floral arrangement trying to remain invisible and catch my breath. I smoothed down the silk of my dress, the only truly expensive item of clothing I owned before today. I had bought it to celebrate the massive acquisition deal my company just closed. I wanted to feel beautiful for once. That was when Brianna spotted me. She marched across the room, her eyes locked onto me with malicious intent. Brianna was a gold digger of the highest order drawn to Trevon because she believed he was the heir to a massive real estate fortune. She hated me because I refused to pretend she was anything else. And that brings us back to the shattered glass and the dark red wine dripping down my dress. The entire room fell uncomfortably silent after Trevon laughed at Brianna's cruel joke. Guests whispered behind their hands, exchanging uncomfortable glances. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply looked at Brianna with a cold, patient clarity. I knew something she did not. I knew the custom suit Trevon was wearing, the diamond ring on her finger, and the very house we were standing in were built on a foundation of lies. I knew their entire world was about to collapse. But before I could say a single word, my mother pushed her way through the crowd. Valerie did not have a look of maternal concern on her face. She looked absolutely furious. She marched up to me, ignoring the broken glass on the floor. She grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin, and pulled me roughly away from the guests. "Look what you have done," she whispered harshly, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You are ruining the photos. You are ruining your brother's special day." I looked down at my ruined dress and back up at the woman who gave birth to me. "Brianna threw wine on me, Mom," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. She walked straight up to me and poured her glass on my chest. Valerie did not care. Her eyes darted around the room, checking to see who was watching us. "I do not want to hear your excuses, Kendra," she snapped, tightening her grip on my arm. "You are always trying to make yourself the victim. You deliberately provoke people with your bad attitude. Go to the kitchen right now and clean yourself up. Hide in the back until it is time to eat. I am not having you ruin our aesthetic of excellence with your pathetic display. Just stay out of sight and do not embarrass us any further." She released my arm and gave me a slight push toward the hallway leading to the kitchen. I stumbled slightly but caught my balance. I looked at the crowd. Trevon was grinning broadly, raising his glass to his friends, as if he had just won a major victory. Brianna was wiping a fake tear of laughter from her eye, pretending to apologize to a guest for the commotion. My father, DeAndre, was standing near the patio doors, deliberately looking in the opposite direction, pretending he did not see his own daughter being humiliated and banished from sight. I walked down the long hallway toward the kitchen, feeling the cold, wet fabric clinging to my skin. The injustice of it all burned in my chest, but I refused to let them see me break. I had spent my entire life crying over their rejection, begging for a scrap of their love and approval. I had tried so hard to be the daughter they wanted, studying late into the night, working myself to exhaustion, just to hear them say they were proud of me. But it was never enough. Because I was not Trevon. Because I chose to forge my own path instead of following their script. In the sterile stainless steel kitchen, I grabbed a cloth and began dabbing at the wine stain. The red liquid had ruined the dress completely. There was no saving it, just like there was no saving my relationship with my family. I tossed the stained cloth into the sink and looked at my reflection in the dark window glass. I was not the weak, useless dropout they thought I was. I was a woman who had built an empire from a dark basement while they wasted their money on empty status symbols. I checked my phone. I had a message from my lawyer, Elias. The final documents were signed. The trap was set. The realization brought a calm, steady peace to my mind. I did not need to scream or fight or beg for respect. I just needed to let the consequences of their own actions catch up to them. I took a deep breath, smoothed my damp dress, and prepared to walk back out there. They wanted me to hide in the shadows, but I was done hiding. The evening was just beginning, and I knew exactly how it was going to end. I stepped out of the kitchen and back into the sprawling living room. The lively chatter of the party washed over me, but I remained anchored in my silent resolve. I moved toward the back wall, finding a spot near the heavy velvet curtains where the shadows offered a small degree of camouflage for my stained dress. From here, I had a perfect vantage point of the entire room. I watched my father DeAndre take his position at the center of the grand staircase. He adjusted the lapels of his velvet dinner jacket, puffing out his chest with an air of absolute self-importance. The sharp, clear ringing cut through the jazz music and the low hum of conversation as he tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. One by one, the elite crowd of doctors, lawyers, and wealthy socialites turned their attention to the patriarch of the family. The room fell into an expectant hush. "Thank you all for being here tonight," my father began, his deep baritone voice carrying effortlessly across the marble foyer. He offered a practiced, charismatic smile that had likely charmed countless investors over the decades. "Tonight, we are not just celebrating a graduation. We are celebrating the culmination of hard work, dedication, and the undeniable power of Black excellence. We are celebrating a legacy." He paused, letting the words hang in the air for dramatic effect. The crowd murmured in polite agreement. My mother Valerie stood a few steps below him, gazing up at him with an expression of manufactured adoration. "Building an empire is not easy," my father continued, sweeping his gaze across the room. "It takes relentless ambition. It requires a mindset that refuses to settle for mediocrity. In this world, you are either a builder or a burden. You either have the vision to conquer mountains, or you lack the drive to succeed and end up watching from the bottom." His eyes deliberately shifted from the wealthy guests in the center of the room to the back wall where I stood. He let his gaze rest on me, just long enough for the people standing nearby to follow his line of sight. A few guests turned their heads, looking at my wine-stained dress and my quiet, isolated posture. I could see the pity and quiet judgment in their eyes. They had all been fed the narrative. I was the college dropout, the failure, the daughter who lacked the drive to succeed. My father was publicly contrasting my supposed worthlessness with his golden son's triumph. It takes a special kind of cruelty to humiliate your own child in front of your peers. But my father did not care about cruelty as long as it elevated his own status. He used my fabricated failure as a dark background to make Trevon's artificial light shine even brighter. I held his gaze, refusing to look down or shrink away. I felt the cold air conditioning against my damp silk dress, but internally I was burning with a quiet, controlled fire. I knew the truth about the empire he was boasting about. I knew that the man giving a speech about relentless ambition had secretly defaulted on his massive commercial loans just 2 months ago. I knew his real estate firm was drowning in debt. I knew this because my holding company was the anonymous entity that had bought that debt for pennies on the dollar. But I kept my face entirely blank, allowing him to dig his own grave with every arrogant word. "But we are not here to talk about those who fall short," my father said smoothly, turning his attention back to Trevon. He smiled, and the coldness in his eyes vanished, replaced by genuine overflowing pride. "We are here to talk about my son. Trevon, you have exceeded every expectation a father could have. Graduating from Stanford University with honors is a monumental achievement. You have proven that you have the blood of a conqueror. You have proven that you are ready to take the reins." The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause. Trevon stood near the front, holding Brianna's hand, soaking in the adulation. He looked like a king receiving his crown. He nodded to the guests, projecting a fake humility that made my stomach churn. My father raised his hand to quiet the applause. Now a milestone of this magnitude requires a celebration of equal measure. "Trevon, my boy, step forward." Trevon walked to the base of the stairs, looking expectant. My father reached into the inner pocket of his velvet jacket and pulled out a small, sleek black box. He opened it to reveal a set of gleaming car keys. But these were not just any keys. They featured the unmistakable yellow and black prancing horse logo. "Everyone, please direct your attention to the front windows," my father announced, pointing dramatically toward the massive floor-to-ceiling glass panels that overlooked the circular driveway. Valerie signaled a hired staff member who quickly pulled back the sheer white drapes. Gasps echoed throughout the living room. Outside, illuminated by strategically placed landscape lighting, sat a brand new Ferrari SF9 Stradale. The car was a masterpiece of automotive engineering, painted in a flawless metallic red that seemed to glow in the dark. It sat low and aggressive on the cobblestone driveway, looking fast even while completely stationary. Tied across the sleek roof and windshield was a massive, obnoxious white ribbon. The room exploded into cheers and whistles. Brianna let out a high-pitched scream of pure joy, jumping up and down and wrapping her arms tightly around Trevin's neck. She was practically vibrating with excitement, already calculating the social media posts and the envious stares of her friends. Trevon looked stunned, playing the part of the overwhelmed, grateful son to absolute perfection. He covered his mouth with one hand and looked up at our father as if he had just been handed the keys to heaven itself. $500,000. That was the sticker price of the car sitting in the driveway. A $500,000 hypercar gifted to a young man who had supposedly just graduated college. The sheer financial absurdity of the gesture was staggering. The guests were whispering furiously to one another, clearly impressed by this blatant display of immense wealth. My parents were eating it up, absorbing the admiration and envy of their peers like oxygen. But the grand illusion was not over. My father walked down the remaining stairs and placed his hand on Trevin's shoulder. He handed him the keys to the Ferrari, and then motioned for Valerie, who stepped forward holding a thick embossed leather folder. "The car is just a toy to get you around," my father said, his voice echoing through the sudden quiet of the room. "It is a reward for your hard work. But the real gift is your future." I took the leather folder from my mother and handed it to Trevon. Inside that folder are the deeds and transfer documents for the lakefront mansion in Tahoe. It is yours free and clear, a place for you and your beautiful bride to start your lives together. And more importantly, there are the executive transfer papers for the family firm. Effective Monday morning, I am stepping down as CEO. I am handing the keys of the empire over to you, Trevon. It is your time to lead. The crowd erupted again, louder this time. A standing ovation for the golden child. People were raising their glasses, shouting congratulations, and clapping enthusiastically. Trevon hugged our father tightly, slapping him on the back. Valerie joined the embrace, completing the picture of the perfect, successful, wealthy family. Brianna was crying, wiping tears carefully so as not to ruin her makeup, staring at the leather folder as if it contained solid gold bars. I stood alone in the back of the room, entirely isolated from the celebration. The physical space between me and my family felt like a massive, uncrossable canyon. The cold, damp silk of my ruined dress clung to my skin, a stark physical reminder of my outcast status. They had given him everything. They had given him the ultimate validation, the ultimate safety net, the ultimate reward. And they had done it while actively ensuring that I received nothing but public humiliation and scorn. The psychological wound they were trying to inflict was clear. They wanted me to feel small. They wanted me to watch them hand over millions of dollars in assets to the son they loved, while I stood in the corner dripping with wine, a supposed failure who could not even afford a proper education. They wanted me to realize that I would never belong in their world of luxury and power. But as I watched the grand illusion play out, I felt absolutely no jealousy. I felt no sorrow. I only felt a deep clinical fascination. I was watching a magic trick from backstage, knowing exactly how the wires were rigged and where the trapdoors were hidden. I knew the truth about the Stanford Honors graduation. Trevon had not seen the inside of a classroom in over a year. I had seen the expulsion records. I knew about the massive underground crypto gambling debts he had racked up trying to maintain his baller lifestyle. I knew the lakefront mansion in Tahoe had multiple liens against it and was weeks away from foreclosure. I knew the real estate empire my father was so proudly handing over was nothing but a hollow shell of toxic assets and defaulted loans. And I knew exactly where the money for that $500,000 Ferrari had come from. It was not the fruit of my father's brilliant investments. It was a desperate, fraudulent lease, secured by emptying the very last remaining operational funds of a dying company. They were celebrating a mirage. They were dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, entirely blind to the water rushing in below them. I stood in the shadows, my hands resting quietly at my sides. I watched Brianna kiss Trevon. I watched my mother bask in the glow of society approval. I watched my father puff out his chest, a king surveying a kingdom made of sand. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully buried the useless daughter and elevated the golden son to the throne. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the jazz music and the sounds of their celebration wash over me. The trap was fully set. The bait had been taken. The audience was gathered. All that was left was for the heavy hammer of reality to swing down and shatter their beautiful, delicate glass world into a million irreparable pieces. I kept my eyes fixed on my father, waiting for the precise moment to strike. The applause slowly died down, replaced by the upbeat tempo of the jazz band kicking into a new lively song. The wealthy guests surged forward to congratulate Trevon and Brianna, creating a chaotic sea of designer gowns and expensive tailored suits. My father stepped down from the grand staircase, accepting eager handshakes and heavy pats on the back, basking in the societal validation he so desperately craved. He looked like a man who had conquered the world, completely unaware that his kingdom was built on quicksand. I retreated further into the shadows, moving deliberately toward the lavish catering tables set up along the far edge of the dining room. The rich aroma of black truffles, roasted garlic, and expensive champagne hung heavy in the air. Waiters in crisp uniforms bustled past me, carrying silver trays of fresh hors d'oeuvres, completely ignoring the woman with the ruined dress, standing silently by the massive swan ice sculpture. I needed a glass of water and a brief moment away from the suffocating heat of their collective delusion. Before I could even reach out to grab a crystal glass, I heard the sharp staccato click of my mother's designer heels approaching rapidly against the polished marble floor. I did not have to turn around to know it was Valerie. Her presence always announced itself with a heavy wave of expensive floral perfume and an overwhelming, suffocating sense of hostility. "I thought I told you to stay hidden in the kitchen, Kendra," she hissed, stepping directly into my personal space. Her voice was pitched perfectly low, ensuring none of her wealthy elite friends standing just a few feet away could hear the pure venom dripping from her words. She maintained a frozen plastic smile for the crowd, while glaring at me with absolute contempt. I turned to face her, maintaining my perfectly blank expression. "I was thirsty, Mom," I said, keeping my tone even and completely unbothered by her aggression. "I am just getting a glass of water before I go back to the corner." Valerie looked me up and down, her eyes lingering maliciously on the massive dark wine stain covering my chest. Her upper lip curled in a sneer of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Look at you," she whispered harshly. "You are an absolute miserable mess. I cannot believe you actually showed up here looking like that. Did you really think you could just walk into this beautiful house and pretend you belong in the same room as these successful people? You do not belong here, Kendra. You never did, and you never will." I did not flinch. Her cruel words were meant to cut deep, to trigger the scared, vulnerable little girl who used to cry alone in her bedroom, wondering why her own mother hated her so much. But that broken little girl was long gone. I just stared back at her silently, watching the desperate insecurity hiding right behind her flawless, expensive makeup. "You are just jealous," Valerie continued, leaning closer until I could smell the champagne on her breath. "You have always been insanely jealous of your brother. You could not handle the intense academic pressure, so you quit like a coward. You chose to be a failure, and now you have to stand here and watch Trevon inherit a massive empire while you have absolutely nothing to your name." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my iced water, letting the cool liquid soothe my throat. "An empire," I repeated softly, raising a single eyebrow. "Is that what we are calling it now? Do not play your little games with me." Valerie snapped, her eyes flashing with sudden, intense anger. "I know exactly why you are really here tonight. You saw the expensive cars parked in the driveway. You saw the luxury catering. You heard the neighborhood rumors about Trevon's grand graduation. And you came crawling back hoping for a pathetic handout." She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, lifting her chin in a theatrical gesture of absolute superiority. "Well, let me make one thing crystal clear to you right now. Do not even think about approaching your brother for money. Trevon is rich and incredibly successful now. He is stepping into the main CEO role and building a perfect life with Brianna. He is managing multi-million-dollar assets. He does not have time to financially support a lazy college dropout who refuses to get a real job. If you ask him for a single dime, I will have the security guards throw you out onto the street myself. The sheer staggering audacity of her warning was almost breathtaking. She was projecting their entire disastrous financial reality directly onto me. She was warning me not to ask for money from a brother who was currently drowning in $500,000 of underground cryptocurrency gambling debt. I am not here to ask Trevon for money, Mom, I said, my voice dropping to a cool, steady whisper. In fact, I do not want anything from him or from you. I never have. Valerie let out a harsh, mocking laugh that sounded like scraping metal. Please, she sneered loudly enough for a passing waiter to glance our way. You are wearing a cheap, ruined silk dress and driving a rusted car that belongs in a junkyard. You are 28 years old, and you have achieved absolutely zero in your pathetic life. You are completely desperate, Kendra. It is written all over your face. I looked past her shoulder, observing Trevon taking a selfie with Brianna in front of the glowing Ferrari outside the massive window. They were posing, kissing, making sure the luxury sports car was perfectly centered in the social media frame. You seem very confident in Trevon's financial stability, I said, keeping my gaze fixed on my brother. It must take a massive amount of liquid cash to buy a brand new Ferrari and throw a lavish party like this, especially for a real estate firm operating in this current difficult economic climate. Valerie's posture instantly went completely rigid. Her eyes narrowed, and for a split second the heavy mask slipped, revealing the sheer blinding panic hiding underneath. She quickly recovered, plastering the arrogant sneer back onto her face. But I saw it clearly. The flinch. The deep terror. She knew I was poking at a very real, very sensitive wound that was bleeding them dry. Instead of backing down, Valerie decided to strike back with the ultimate weapon. She wanted to crush any remaining ounce of defiance left in my body. She wanted to prove her absolute total dominance over me. She stepped so close to me that I could feel her ragged breath on my face. Her eyes were wide, manic, and completely devoid of any maternal affection. You think you are so remarkably smart? Valerie whispered, her voice trembling with dark, vicious arrogance. You think you can stand there and judge us? You should be thanking us, Kendra. You should be down on your knees showing daily gratitude for everything we have done. I met her intense gaze, refusing to look away or show any weakness. Gratitude for what exactly, I asked calmly. Valerie smiled, a twisted, cruel expression that literally chilled the air around us. She leaned in until her lips were mere inches from my ear. You always thought you were so fiercely independent, she hissed. But you only survived because we allowed it. That $300,000 trust fund your grandmother left you. The one you thought you were going to access when you turned 25. My breath caught slightly in my throat, but I forced my facial muscles to remain entirely still. My grandmother had been the only person in the family who truly loved me unconditionally. She had set up a secure trust fund specifically for me, meant to help me buy my first home or start a solid business. I had deliberately chosen not to touch it, leaving it in the bank account to grow while I built Oripay with my own bare hands. We drained it, Valerie whispered, her tone laced with absolute sick triumph. We drained every single penny of your precious little trust fund. We forged the legal authorization documents years ago, right after you decided to drop out and embarrass us in front of our friends. She pulled back slightly to watch my face closely, expecting to see tears welling in my eyes, expecting to see me break down in loud hysterics. I gave her absolutely nothing. Where do you think the money for Trevon's expensive Stanford tuition came from? Valerie continued, her voice dripping with venomous pride. Where do you think the money for this massive catering bill came from? The ice sculptures, the vintage imported champagne. We took your entire future and we gave it to your brother. It was a necessary investment in the only child who actually matters in this family. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and incredibly toxic. She had just confessed to a massive federal crime. She had just admitted to brutally stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from her own daughter to fund the fraudulent luxury lifestyle of her golden child. And she was boasting about it. She was weaponizing her own disgusting crime to inflict maximum psychological pain. Valerie waited eagerly for my reaction. She was feeding on the anticipation, ready to call her hired security the moment I raised my voice, ready to play the innocent victim the moment I shed a single tear. She wanted a dramatic scene. She wanted to prove to everyone in the room that I was the unstable, hysterical failure they had always claimed I was. But the tears never came. The powerful urge to scream vanished entirely. In that precise moment, a profound psychological shift occurred deep within my mind. The last lingering thread of daughterly obligations snapped cleanly in two. The final drop of empathy I held for the wicked woman standing in front of me evaporated into thin air. The hurt, the deep betrayal, the years of desperate longing for her approval. It all burned away rapidly, leaving behind nothing but a terrifying absolute calmness. I felt my heartbeat slow down to a steady rhythm. My breathing became incredibly deep and measured. I was no longer looking at my mother. I was looking at a desperate criminal, a pathetic fraud, a parasite who had actively tried to feed on my future. I did not yell. I did not curse at her. I simply looked at her with eyes so completely cold and empty that her triumphant, wicked smile began to falter and crack. The silence stretched between us, unnerving and completely unnatural. She had launched her most devastating psychological nuclear weapon, and it had bounced off my heavy armor without leaving a single scratch. "You are suspiciously quiet," Valerie noted, her voice losing a significant fraction of its arrogant edge. "Good. Keep it exactly that way. Remember your proper place, Kendra." I slowly lifted my left arm, deliberately pulling back the stained silk sleeve of my dress to reveal the solid gold Rolex Daytona strapped tightly to my wrist. I tapped the heavy crystal face with my index finger, noting the exact, precise time. It was exactly 7:45 in the evening. "What are you doing?" Valerie asked, frowning deeply at the heavy watch she likely assumed was a cheap street knockoff. "Just checking the current time, Mom," I said, my voice incredibly smooth and perfectly detached. I lowered my arm and let my silk sleeve fall back into its place. I looked past her shoulder toward the heavy mahogany front doors of the massive mansion. The chess pieces were all in active motion. The heavy legal filings were fully processed. The massive bank transfers were permanently locked. The ultimate devastating consequence was barreling toward them all like a massive runaway freight train, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. "I am not going to ask Trevin for any money," I said, looking back into Valerie's deeply uncertain eyes. "And I am not going to throw a loud tantrum over the stolen trust fund. You made your precious investment, Mom. Let us just see what kind of return you actually get." Valerie stared at me, visibly deeply unsettled by my complete lack of emotional response. She opened her mouth to deliver another harsh insult, but the cruel words died instantly in her throat. She could sense the massive shift in power. She could physically feel the sudden icy drop in the room's atmospheric pressure. I simply smiled at her, a small, incredibly sharp, predatory smile, turned smoothly on my heel, and walked away from the catering tables. I moved deliberately toward the center of the grand living room, placing myself right in the middle of the massive crowd. I was not hiding in the dark shadows anymore. The ticking countdown had officially begun, and I desperately wanted a front row seat for the impending destruction of their lies. I positioned myself next to a towering crystal vase of white orchids directly in my father's line of sight. DeAndre was still holding court near the grand piano, laughing loudly at a joke made by a prominent local judge. He swirled the remaining champagne in his flute, projecting the image of a man without a single care in the world. But I noticed the slight tremor in his hand, and the way his eyes constantly darted toward the front entrance. He was waiting for something or someone to validate his fragile ego. Instead, he got the head of the catering staff. The man was dressed in a sharp black tuxedo with a discreet earpiece, a stark contrast to the colorful party attire of the guests. He moved through the crowd with professional urgency, carrying a sleek black leather folder. I recognized him from the elite event planning firm my mother always bragged about using. They were known for their exorbitant prices and their strict payment upon completion policies. The caterer approached my father, leaning in close to murmur something discreetly. I watched my father's face carefully. The transformation was instantaneous. The arrogant, jovial mask slipped, revealing a flash of pure, unadulterated panic. His jaw clenched and his knuckles turned white as he gripped his champagne flute. He took the leather folder, opening it just a fraction to glance at the total. I did not need to see the paper to know the exact amount. $15,000. That was the cost of the imported caviar, the premium open bar, the towering ice sculptures, and the synchronized jazz band. In the past, $15,000 would have been pocket change for my father. He would have casually handed over a black card without breaking conversation. Tonight, however, $15,000 was a mountain he could not climb. His company accounts were frozen. His personal credit cards were maxed out. He was completely broke. DeAndre aggressively whispered something back to the caterer, attempting to hand the folder away. The caterer shook his head firmly, maintaining his polite but unyielding stance. He tapped the document indicating the strict payment terms. The firm did not do net 30 invoices for clients with rapidly deteriorating credit scores. They wanted their money tonight. I watched the gears turning in my father's head. He looked around the room, his eyes scanning the faces of his wealthy friends. He could not admit he was broke. He could not ask for an extension in front of the judge, the hospital administrators, and the country club elite. To do so would completely shatter the illusion of black excellence he had spent decades carefully cultivating. He needed a scapegoat. He needed someone to shoulder the financial burden and absorb the immediate damage. His eyes finally landed on me. I saw the dark, desperate calculation wash over his face. He remembered the rumors my mother had been spreading all night about my supposed successful overseas career. He remembered the narrative they had built to explain my absence. If he played his cards right, he could use their own lies to trap me. He assumed that since I had shown up, I must be desperate for their approval. He assumed I would do anything to avoid public embarrassment. DeAndre grabbed a silver spoon and tapped his glass again, calling for silence. The jazz band immediately stopped playing. The lively chatter died down as the guests turned their attention back to the patriarch. "Family and friends!" My father announced, his voice booming across the marble foyer, but carrying a high-pitched edge of forced enthusiasm. As you all know, tonight is about celebrating legacy and achievement. But it is also about family unity. It is about coming together and supporting one another in our respective journeys. He stepped away from the piano and walked directly toward me, parting the sea of guests. The crowd naturally formed a circle around us, leaving me isolated in the center, with the man who had disowned me years ago. My father stopped a few feet away, flashing a broad, theatrical smile that did not reach his panicked eyes. "For years, our eldest daughter, Kendra, has been carving her own path," he declared, gesturing toward me with open arms. "She has faced her share of challenges. She made some choices in the past that caused a rift in our family. She walked away from her education and struggled to find her footing." The guests whispered among themselves, throwing me side glances. They were eating up the drama. "But tonight is about forgiveness," my father continued, his voice rising in volume. "Tonight is about making amends. Kendra has returned to us wanting to demonstrate her newfound maturity. She has expressed a deep desire to make up for her past mistakes and her lack of contribution to this family. Therefore, she has graciously offered to cover the entire cost of tonight's magnificent catering as a token of her gratitude and a step toward family reconciliation." He practically shoved the black leather folder into my hands. "Let us hear it for Kendra," demonstrating that it is never too late to step up and take responsibility. The crowd erupted into polite, scattered applause. The sheer audacity of the ambush was breathtaking. He was publicly cornering me, framing a $15,000 extortion attempt as a beautiful act of familial redemption. He was banking entirely on my social anxiety and my supposed desperation to belong. I thought I would simply hand over a credit card, going into massive debt, just to avoid ruining the touching moment he had orchestrated. Valerie rushed to his side, joining the performance. She placed a hand over her heart, looking at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Oh, Kendra," she exclaimed loudly, her voice trembling with fake emotion. "This is such a beautiful gesture. We know how much you have struggled. We know how hard it must be for you to part with whatever small savings you have managed to scrape together. But this shows real growth. It shows you finally understand the importance of giving back to the family that raised you." Brianna stepped forward from the crowd, her eyes gleaming with malicious joy. She knew exactly what was happening. She knew my parents were broke, and she loved seeing me put on the spot. "Wow," Kendra Brianna chimed in, her tone dripping with condescension. I guess doing laundry and answering phones abroad really pays off. $15,000 is a lot of money for someone without a college degree. Are you sure your little bank account can handle it? We would not want your card to decline in front of all these important people. Trevin laughed loudly from the stairs, holding his keys to the leased Ferrari. Yeah, sis, do not write a check your minimal wage job cannot cash. If you need me to cover it, just say the word. I am feeling generous tonight. The psychological pressure in the room was immense. The expectation hung heavy in the air, pressing down on my shoulders. Dozens of wealthy, influential people were staring at me, waiting for me to pull out my wallet and play the part of the repentant failure buying her way back into the good graces of her superior family. They were judging my stained dress, my silent demeanor, and my perceived financial inadequacy. DeAndre took a step closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. Pay the man right now, Kendra, he hissed through a clenched smile. Do not you dare embarrass me in front of these people. You owe us this. You owe us for every embarrassment you have ever caused. Hand over your card, or I will ruin whatever pathetic little life you have managed to build for yourself. Valerie leaned in from the other side, her perfume suffocating me. Do it, she whispered, her tone lethal. If you refuse, I will tell everyone here that you came begging for a handout. I will tell them you are a thief. You will never be able to show your face in this town again. Just pay the bill and we might let you stay for dessert. They were cornering me, using every manipulative tactic in their arsenal. They were weaponizing public shame, leveraging their social status to force my compliance. They assumed I was still the fragile 22-year-old girl who used to cry when they yelled at her. They assumed my fear of their wrath would override my common sense. They thought their psychological control over me was absolute and unbreakable. They believed they had executed the perfect trap, keeping their own severe cash flow problems completely hidden from their high society friends, while simultaneously forcing their scapegoat daughter to shoulder the financial burden of their fake excellence. I stood perfectly still, holding the black leather folder in my hands. I felt the smooth texture of the leather beneath my fingertips. I looked at the caterer, who was standing awkwardly a few feet away, shifting his weight from side to side, visibly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding before him, but determined to secure his payment. I looked at the crowd of guests, their faces displaying a mixture of morbid curiosity and elitist amusement. They were waiting for me to submit. They were waiting for me to bow my head and accept my punishment. Then I looked at DeAndre and Valerie. I saw the desperate sweat beading on my father's forehead. I saw the frantic, manic energy in my mother's eyes. I saw the hollow, rotten core of their entire existence laid bare. They were not powerful. They were terrified. They were drowning animals desperately trying to pull me under the water to keep themselves afloat for just one more minute. The ticking countdown had reached 0. The explosive charges were fully primed. The audience was completely captivated. The stage was perfectly set for the most spectacular demolition this neighborhood had ever witnessed. I did not feel fear. I did not feel shame. I felt an overwhelming surge of pure, concentrated power. I took a slow, deep breath, adjusting my grip on the leather folder, preparing to deliver the first devastating blow. I did not hand the black leather book to my father. I did not look down at the marble floor in shame. I did not shrink away from the burning stares of the Potomac elite who surrounded me. Instead, I turned my body slightly facing the head of the catering staff, who stood there with an expression of mounting professional impatience. I extended my arm and pressed the leather folder firmly back into his hands. Then I shifted my gaze back to DeAndre. I looked at the throbbing vein pulsing erratically in his neck. I looked at the desperate, terrified plea hiding just behind his furious, wide eyes. He was silently begging me to submit, to play the role of the compliant, broken victim, to save him from the public exposure of his own massive financial failures. I opened my mouth and let a single syllable ring out through the cavernous living room. No. The word was not shouted. It was not screamed in a fit of hysterical emotional rage. It was spoken with absolute crystal-clear authority. It carried the heavy, undeniable weight of a judge delivering a final, unappealable sentence. It sliced through the thick, humid air of the lavish mansion like a sharpened steel blade severing a heavy rope. I am not paying for a party I was explicitly told to hide from. I added, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings and the expensive crystal chandeliers. I am not funding this delusion. Pay your own bills, DeAndre. A collective sharp gasp erupted from the wealthy crowd. The sound of dozens of high society doctors, lawyers, and socialites simultaneously drawing in their breath created a sudden vacuum in the room. The absolute shock was palpable. In their pristine, carefully curated world, children did not speak to their successful parents with such cold, raw defiance. Daughters did not publicly humiliate their generous fathers. The polite silence instantly shattered, replaced by a frantic rising tide of appalled whispers. I could hear their harsh judgments swirling around me. They called me ungrateful. They called me a disaster. They muttered about how heartbreaking it was to see such a prominent, respected family cursed with such a rebellious, defective child. Trevin did not hesitate. The golden child felt his moment of absolute glory, being threatened by the sister he viewed as completely beneath him. He stomped down the remaining stairs of the grand staircase, the heavy, aggressive sound of his custom leather shoes slapping against the marble floor. His face was flushed a deep, angry red, completely ruining his perfectly composed billionaire aesthetic. He puffed out his chest, inflating his posture to physically dominate the space between us. He marched right up to me, stopping just inches away, attempting to use his height and his gender to intimidate me back into submission. "You broke, miserable loser!" Trevon spat the words, hitting me with a spray of venomous contempt. "How dare you speak to our father like that? You are an absolute disgrace to this family. You have always been a disgrace. You stand there in your cheap, ruined clothes, dripping with wine, looking like a pathetic beggar, and you have the audacity to act arrogant." He pointed a manicured finger aggressively at my face, his eyes wide with furious indignation. "You are just mad because you will never achieve a fraction of what I have. You are a lazy college dropout who cannot even afford to dry clean her own clothes. You are jealous because I am graduating from Stanford and inheriting an empire while you are stuck writing useless code in some dark basement. You are nothing, Kendra. You are less than nothing." I did not flinch. I did not blink. I simply stared at my brother, studying the frantic desperation vibrating underneath his loud, aggressive performance. He was shouting about an empire he did not know was already reduced to ashes. He was bragging about a degree he never actually earned. He was a hollow, empty vessel echoing with the sounds of stolen money. Brianna quickly joined the assault, sensing an opportunity to perform her role as the fiercely loyal future wife. She rushed to Trevon's side, grabbing his arm and glaring at me with eyes full of pure, unadulterated malice. She wanted to ensure the wealthy guests saw her defending the family honor. "Get her out of here!" Brianna shrieked, her voice pitching into a shrill, grating frequency that made several guests wince. "She is completely unstable. She is ruining our entire night with her psychotic jealousy. Trevon, baby, tell the security guards to throw her out before she tries to steal the silver. We do not need this kind of trash breathing the same air as our important guests. She is just a bitter, desperate failure trying to drag you down to her pathetic level." The coordinated attack was designed to break me down completely. They wanted me to cry, to apologize, to run away in shame, so they could quickly swipe my credit card and return to their celebration. But their words felt entirely weightless. They were throwing paper arrows at a solid titanium wall. Then came the true masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. Valerie, having realized that direct intimidation was failing spectacularly, immediately pivoted to her most effective weapon: theatrical public victimhood. She let out a loud, tragic wail that cut through the escalating arguments. She clutched her chest with both hands, her face twisting into a mask of absolute, unbearable agony. She stumbled backward, falling dramatically against the polished wood of the grand piano, as if the sheer emotional pain of my existence had physically struck her down. A nearby guest rushed forward to support her weight, murmuring words of deep comfort. Valerie allowed the tears to flow perfectly, cascading down her cheeks, without ruining her expensive, flawless makeup. "Why, Lord, why did you punish me with such a spiteful, jealous daughter?" Valerie cried out, ensuring her trembling voice reached every single corner of the massive room. "We tried so hard. We gave her everything a child could ever want. We loved her, we supported her, we prayed for her. And she comes into our home on the most important night of her brother's life, just to publicly humiliate us." She buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly, pulling the entire room into her web of deceit. She hates seeing her brother succeed. Valerie wailed, her voice muffled by her hands. She hates seeing us happy. She is trying to destroy this beautiful family because her own heart is so full of dark, bitter resentment. What did we do to deserve such cruelty? The crowd was completely captivated by her performance. I could feel the intense waves of sympathy rolling toward my mother, and the equally intense waves of disgust rolling toward me. I was the villain in their perfectly scripted play. I was the monster who had brought tears to the eyes of a loving, devoted mother. But the dramatic performance was abruptly cut short by a force that did not care about family dynamics or high society feelings. "Excuse me, sir," the head caterer said, his voice cutting sharply through Valerie's theatrical sobbing. The man in the sharp black tuxedo stepped directly into DeAndre's line of sight, entirely unfazed by the emotional chaos erupting around him. He held the black leather folder out, pointing a rigid finger at the bottom line. His professional patience had completely evaporated, replaced by the stern, unyielding demand of a businessman protecting his bottom line. "I apologize for the interruption to your evening," the caterer said, his tone incredibly stiff and formal. "But my staff has been working for 8 hours and my vendors require immediate compensation. The contract clearly states that payment must be rendered in full before the dessert service begins. I need a valid credit card on file right now to process the $15,000 balance. If you cannot provide immediate payment, I am instructing my staff to begin packing up the remaining food, dismantling the open bar, and leaving the premises immediately." The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Dismantling the bar and packing up the food in the middle of the party would be the ultimate, undeniable confirmation of their financial ruin. There would be no recovering from that level of public humiliation. The elite guests would know instantly that DeAndre and Valerie were completely broke. DeAndre realized in that precise moment that his stalling tactics had failed entirely. His elaborate facade was cracking violently, revealing the terrifying reality underneath. The impending humiliation was no longer a distant possibility, it was standing right in front of him, demanding a credit card he did not possess. The suffocating fear in DeAndre's eyes morphed instantly into explosive, violent rage. The transition from manipulative, charismatic patriarch to a desperate, cornered animal was terrifyingly swift. He blamed me entirely for the imminent collapse of his social standing. In his mind, my refusal to be his financial sacrificial lamb was an act of unforgivable treason. He marched toward me, closing the distance between us with heavy, aggressive strides. His fists were clenched so tightly by his sides that his knuckles were stark white against his dark skin. His face was contorted into a mask of pure, unrestrained fury, the veins in his neck and forehead bulging visibly. He was attempting to use sheer, overwhelming physical intimidation to crush my resistance. "You ungrateful, arrogant little brat!" DeAndre roared, his voice vibrating with a dangerous, lethal edge. He completely abandoned his polished elite persona, exposing the vicious bully hiding beneath the expensive velvet jacket. "You will take out your card, and you will hand it to this man right now." He stepped directly into my personal space, looming over me, trying to force me to step backward. I planted my feet firmly into the marble floor, refusing to yield a single inch of ground. "You owe us for every breath you take!" DeAndre spat, saliva flying from his lips as he shouted down at me. "You owe us for every piece of clothing on your back and every meal you ever ate under my roof. You will pay this bill, or I swear to God I will make you regret the day you were born. I will destroy whatever pathetic, miserable little life you have managed to build. I will tear you down to nothing. Give him the card, Kendra. Do it now." He raised his hand slightly, his body tense and coiled, radiating the very real threat of physical violence. The entire room held its collective breath, waiting to see if the patriarch would actually strike his own daughter in the middle of a high society gala. Brianna watched with eager anticipation. Trevon smiled, a cruel, satisfied smile, waiting for my ultimate surrender. Valerie peeked out from behind her hands, pausing her fake tears to watch the intimidation unfold. I stood my ground, unblinking, entirely unafraid, meeting my father's furious, murderous gaze with eyes that held the chilling depth of a frozen ocean. I was waiting for him to make his final, fatal mistake. Just as DeAndre leaned in, inches from my face, roaring his demands, a sudden, distinct sound interrupted the escalating violence. It was not a voice. It was the sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps. solid, authoritative, and echoing powerfully off the polished marble floors of the grand foyer. The footsteps moved with a deliberate, unhurried precision, completely cutting through the tension in the dining room. Every single head in the room, including my father's, snapped toward the entrance. The massive, heavy oak doors of the mansion were swinging wide open, and the entire energetic frequency of the room shifted violently in an instant. I did not hand the black leather book to my father. I did not look down at the marble floor in shame. I did not shrink away from the burning stares of the Potomac elite who surrounded me. Instead, I turned my body slightly facing the head of the catering staff, who stood there with an expression of mounting professional impatience. I extended my arm and pressed the leather folder firmly back into his hands. "You will receive every single penny you are owed tonight," I assured him, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any panic. "But you will not be getting it from me, and you certainly will not be getting it from the man standing by the piano. Keep your staff on standby. This party is effectively over, but your payment is completely guaranteed by Horizon Holdings." The caterer nodded sharply, stepping backward into the periphery of the room. He sensed the raw, undeniable authority radiating from my side of the floor and chose the winning team without a second thought. I turned my attention fully back to my father. DeAndre was staring at me with a horrific mixture of rage and sheer panic. His perfectly tailored velvet jacket suddenly looked like a clown costume on a man who had completely forgotten his lines. Elias did not waste a single second. He raised his right hand and snapped was crisp, sharp, and commanded immediate action. The two massive security guards stepped forward immediately. They approached the huge, polished oak dining table that served as the centerpiece of the foyer. Without asking for permission, they aggressively shoved aside a towering crystal vase and a massive silver platter of imported cheeses. The clatter of expensive silverware hitting the floor made several guests jump in surprise. The guards placed their heavy metal briefcases flat on the table. The metallic clicks of the briefcases unlocking sounded like gunshots in the silent room. Elias stepped up to the table. He reached inside the velvet-lined cases and began pulling out thick, heavy stacks of legal paperwork. These were not simple printouts. They were bound legal contracts stamped with vibrant red federal seals, bank insignias, and aggressive foreclosure warnings. He lined them up across the table with terrifying surgical precision. DeAndre took a shaky, trembling step forward. The arrogant patriarch who had just gifted a $500,000 car was now sweating profusely. His eyes darted wildly across the prominent red stamps visible on the documents. He recognized the specific letterhead of his primary commercial lenders. "This is a complete fabrication!" DeAndre shouted, his voice cracking entirely. He pointed a shaking finger at Elias, trying to muster a shred of his former authority. "I do not know what kind of fraudulent stunt you are trying to pull here, but my company is an institution. We are the premier real estate investment firm in Maryland. You cannot just walk into my home and make these ridiculous claims. I will have you disbarred for this." I stepped in front of Elias, blocking my father's desperate attempt to intimidate my lawyer. I kept my posture entirely relaxed, projecting the absolute confidence of a predator that had already trapped its prey. "You do not have a company anymore, DeAndre." I stated, my voice carrying effortlessly to every single guest in the room. "You have a hollow shell of toxic assets and massive defaulted loans. You have not closed a profitable real estate deal in 4 years. Your commercial lenders sent you a final notice of default exactly 2 months ago." The crowd gasped again. The wealthy doctors and lawyers who had trusted DeAndre with their own investments began whispering frantically. A few men subtly pulled out their phones, likely texting their financial advisors to pull any money they had tied up in my father's firm. "You are lying," Valerie shrieked from the grand staircase. She gripped the wooden banister so tightly her knuckles were completely white. "We are doing incredibly well. We just bought Trevon a Ferrari. Tell them, DeAndre. Tell them she is a jealous, bitter liar trying to ruin our flawless reputation." I did not even look at my mother. I kept my eyes locked directly onto my father, watching the absolute terror completely consume his features. "You did not buy that car," I said calmly, exposing the ugly truth layer by layer. "You illegally embezzled the last $70,000 of operational funds from your dying company to lease it for 48 hours. You committed severe corporate fraud just to secure a shiny prop for your neighborhood performance. You literally stole money from your remaining investors so you could take pretty pictures for social media. The collective shock in the room intensified. Trevon looked down at the Ferrari keys in his hand as if they had suddenly turned into a live grenade. Brianna took a slow, deliberate step away from Trevon, her eyes darting nervously around the room, her gold-digging instincts sensing the immediate danger of an empty bank account. DeAndre shook his head violently, his eyes wild and unfocused. "No," he stammered, taking another unsteady step toward the table. "The bank did not foreclose. The bank sold our debt. They sold it to a massive private equity fund. Horizon Holdings bought our commercial debt. They gave us a restructuring period. We have time. Horizon Holdings is a billion-dollar conglomerate." He grabbed the edge of the table, leaning heavily over the stacked documents. He was desperately clinging to the false hope that he still had a negotiating window. He believed a faceless corporate entity would eventually give him a favorable bailout. I let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I walked slowly up to the table, standing directly across from him. I looked down at the primary acquisition document that Elias had perfectly centered on the oak wood. Horizon Holdings is not a billion-dollar conglomerate. DeAndre. I explained my tone perfectly, steady and ruthless. Horizon Holdings is a private subsidiary. It is a completely anonymous shell corporation created entirely for my personal asset management. I established it specifically to handle aggressive corporate acquisitions without drawing public media attention. DeAndre stared at me, his brain completely refusing to process the words leaving my mouth. The concept was entirely alien to him. He could not reconcile the image of the daughter he had abused and discarded with the reality of the corporate titan standing before him. I tapped a perfectly manicured finger directly onto the signature line of the massive acquisition contract. "Look at the signature, DeAndre." I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. "Look at the name of the person who owns every single brick of this mansion, every single property in your failed portfolio, and every single cent of your massive crushing debt." My father slowly lowered his gaze to the heavy legal paper. His eyes tracked across the thick black ink of the authorized signature. He read the name printed clearly beneath the cursive handwriting. Kendra M., founder and chief executive officer, Horizon Holdings. He let out a strange choking sound, a pathetic wheeze of pure disbelief. He stumbled backward as if the document had physically burned his hands. He looked at me, his eyes wide with an absolute soul-crushing horror. How he whispered, his voice breaking completely. "How could you possibly afford this? The debt was purchased for $45 million in cash. You do not have that kind of money. You are a dropout. You write code in a basement." I stood tall, allowing the full weight of my actual identity to wash over the entire room. I raised my voice, ensuring every single elite guest heard the final devastating truth. "I am not just a coder," I declared, projecting my voice with absolute supreme authority. 3 years ago, I built a financial technology application from the ground up. I designed the architecture, I wrote the security protocols, and I secured the venture capital funding entirely on my own. My company is called AuraPay. The name hit the crowd like a massive electrical shock. The silence was instantly replaced by a loud, frantic uproar of recognition. AuraPay was not just a successful business. It was a revolutionary financial platform used by millions of people globally. It was the premier payment processing application that half the wealthy guests in this very room currently had installed on their smartphones. "That is impossible," a prominent tech investor shouted from the back of the room, pushing his way forward. "The founder of AuraPay is completely anonymous. The media has never verified their identity." Elias stepped forward, addressing the investor directly. "The founder chose anonymity to avoid the invasive scrutiny of the press," he explained in a booming, authoritative voice. However, the acquisition documents filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission earlier today are completely public record. Kendra is the sole founder, majority shareholder, and active chief executive officer of AuraPay. Her company was officially valued at $800 million during the last funding round. The room exploded into absolute pandemonium. The wealthy socialites were literally gasping for air. The doctors and lawyers were pulling out their phones, frantically searching the internet for breaking financial news. The realization that they were standing in the presence of a legitimate self-made tech titan completely rewired their entire perception of reality. They looked at my ruined wine-stained dress, and suddenly it did not look like a symbol of failure anymore. It looked like the eccentric choice of a genius billionaire who simply did not care about the trivial rules of high society fashion. Valerie let out a piercing hysterical scream from the stairs. She scrambled down the marble steps, entirely abandoning her elegant posture. She rushed toward the table, her eyes locked onto the legal documents in absolute manic disbelief. "No, no, no," she shrieked, grabbing a stack of papers and waving them frantically in the air. "This is a trick. This is a sick, twisted psychological game. My daughter is a broke, useless failure. She did not build a $1 billion company. She is just trying to humiliate us. Tell them, DeAndre. Tell them this paperwork is fake." But DeAndre could not speak. He was staring at the red federal stamps and the bank insignias with eyes completely void of hope. He knew the paperwork was entirely authentic. He recognized the binding legal seals. He knew his empire was completely, utterly dead. I looked at Valerie, who was clutching the papers to her chest like a desperate lifeline. "The golden child illusion you built was a pathetic fantasy, Mom," I said, my voice carrying a terrifying glacial calmness. "You stole my $300,000 trust fund to pay for a fake degree and a fake lifestyle. You bankrupted your own company to maintain a fake image of black excellence. And you tried to use me as your final sacrificial lamb to pay for this very party." I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, backing her against the heavy oak table. "But you made one massive, fatal miscalculation. You vastly underestimated the daughter you threw away. You tried to bury me in the dirt, but you forgot that I was the one who actually knew how to build things from scratch." Valerie's hands began to shake violently, dropping the heavy legal documents onto the floor. The papers scattered across the polished marble, a chaotic mess of undeniable financial ruin. I turned my gaze to Trevon, who was gripping the banister of the staircase, looking as though he might throw up. The smug, arrogant expression had been completely wiped from his face, replaced by the hollow, terrified look of a fraud who had just been brutally exposed to the sunlight. "Your empire is officially gone, DeAndre," I stated, turning back to my father, who was still leaning heavily against the table. "Horizon Holdings owns everything. This house, the cars, the remaining assets. And as the new primary creditor, I am officially calling in all your debts immediately." The absolute silence that followed my declaration was heavy enough to crush bone. My father stared at me, his chest heaving as he struggled to draw air into his collapsing lungs. He looked around the room, searching for a single friendly face, a single wealthy ally who might step forward and denounce my claims. He found absolutely no one. The elite guests of Potomac, who had been drinking his imported champagne just moments ago, were now practically pressing themselves against the far walls, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of his financial ruin. DeAndre finally found his voice, though it was a weak, raspy imitation of his usual booming baritone. "You cannot do this," he gasped, gripping the edge of the dining table so hard his fingernails threatened to snap. "The banks gave us a grace period. They promised us time to restructure. We were negotiating a bailout package. You cannot just swoop in and call the debts. That is illegal. I will have my lawyers tie you up in litigation for the next decade." I did not even have to answer his pathetic threat. I simply stepped aside and let Elias do exactly what I pay him millions of dollars a year to do. Elias stepped forward, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the marble. He reached into his second briefcase, the one the security guard had just placed on the table. He did not pull out a single document. He pulled out a massive stack of heavily bound legal files, dropping them onto the pristine table with a loud, resounding thud that made my mother flinch. "There is no grace period," DeAndre Elias stated, his voice projecting with the cold, mechanical precision of a seasoned corporate executioner. "There are no ongoing negotiations, and there certainly is no bailout package. Your firm has been functionally bankrupt for exactly 62 days. You missed 3 consecutive payroll cycles. You defaulted on 4 major commercial mortgages. You completely drained your operational accounts to maintain this fraudulent lifestyle. Your entire real estate empire is nothing but a spectacularly poorly managed mirage." The crowd gasped again. A prominent real estate developer in the back of the room aggressively whispered to his wife, confirming that he had suspected DeAndre was over-leveraged for months. The whispered confirmations spread like a virus, validating every single word Elias spoke. The high society facade was burning to the ground right in front of their eyes. Valerie let out a sharp, frantic cry. She rushed toward the table, slamming her hands down on the stacks of paper. "It is a lie," she shrieked, her carefully maintained high society accent slipping entirely. "We are asset rich. We have properties across the entire eastern seaboard. We have equity. We are a pillar of this community." I turned to face my mother, my expression completely devoid of any sympathy. "You do not have equity, Mom." I corrected her gently but firmly. "You have a mountain of toxic liabilities. You leveraged your existing properties to buy new ones, and when the market shifted, you doubled down on fraudulent loan applications to cover the margins. You lied about your asset valuations to secure more cash, just so you could keep throwing lavish parties like this one to impress people who do not even like you." I slowly walked around the table, forcing my parents to turn and face me. I addressed the entire room, ensuring that every wealthy guest, every country club member, and every judgmental relative heard the absolute unvarnished truth. "For years, my parents have stood in front of you, preaching about the virtues of hard work and the undeniable power of their legacy." I announced, my voice ringing clear and steady. "They called me a useless failure because I refused to participate in their charade. But their entire empire was a literal scheme built on pure arrogance and gross financial mismanagement." 2 months ago, the walls finally caved in. I looked back at DeAndre, whose eyes were wide with sheer animalistic terror. "The bank auditors caught the massive discrepancies in your loan applications." "Dad," I continued, exposing the darkest secret he had been desperately trying to hide. "They found the forged property valuations. They saw the money you illegally transferred to your personal accounts to maintain your country club memberships. They were preparing to hand your entire file over to the federal authorities. You were not just facing a standard corporate bankruptcy, you were facing a lengthy sentence in a federal penitentiary for massive commercial bank fraud." Deandra's legs finally gave out completely. He collapsed heavily into one of the velvet dining chairs, his head falling into his hands. He let out a low, agonizing groan, realizing that his deepest, most heavily guarded secret was now public knowledge. The influential judges and lawyers in the room stared at him with open disgust, actively stepping further away from the man they now recognized as a desperate criminal. But the bank did not want a messy, highly publicized federal investigation. I explained, pacing slowly in front of the crowd. A scandal of that magnitude would have damaged their own stock prices and ruined their quarterly reports. They wanted to quietly offload the toxic debt and wash their hands of your entire fraudulent existence. So they held a highly discreet private auction for your distressed assets. They offered your entire portfolio, your loans, your mortgages, your commercial properties for literally pennies on the dollar to a select group of elite private equity firms. I stopped pacing and stood directly in front of my father. I looked down at him, watching him tremble violently in the velvet chair. He could not even bring himself to look me in the eye. Horizon Holdings swooped in and bought the debt. I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "I bought your entire miserable existence, DeAndre. I bought the primary mortgage on this lavish mansion. I bought the defaulted loans on your failing commercial properties. I bought the very chair you are sitting in right now. And I bought it all for absolute pennies." Valerie was shaking her head back and forth, her perfectly highlighted hair falling into her face. She looked like a woman who had just watched her entire reality disintegrate into dust. But how she gasped, tears of genuine terror streaming down her cheeks. "How could you possibly afford millions of dollars in debt acquisition? You dropped out of college. You were living in a tiny apartment. You were coding in a basement." I smiled, a sharp, predatory smile that offered absolutely no comfort. "I was coding in a basement," I confirmed. "But I was not writing useless scripts to pass the time. I was building the foundational architecture for Orapay. While you were throwing away thousands of dollars on designer clothes to impress people who do not care about you, I was securing massive venture capital funding from the most ruthless tech investors in Silicon Valley. While you were stealing my $300,000 trust fund to pay for Trevon's fake lifestyle, I was finalizing a corporate valuation of $800 million. I stepped closer to Valerie, forcing her to look at my ruined wine-stained silk dress. I am the sole founder and chief executive officer of a financial technology giant. Mom, I stated, letting the words strike her like physical blows. My company processes billions of dollars in digital transactions every single month. I do not just have enough money to buy your pathetic debt. I have enough money to buy the entire bank that issued your loans in the first place. The sheer scale of my wealth finally registered in Valerie's eyes. The realization that the daughter she had mocked, abused, and discarded was actually a spectacularly powerful tech billionaire completely broke her mind. She let out a loud, tragic wail, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, realizing the catastrophic magnitude of her mistake. She had actively alienated and humiliated the one person who could have easily saved them all. Elias stepped forward again, pulling a sleek silver pen from his jacket pocket. He placed it carefully on top of the heavy legal documents. The terms of the debt acquisition give Horizon Holdings immediate executive control over all remaining assets, Elias announced, addressing my father. We are officially executing the immediate call option on your defaulted commercial loans. You have exactly 0 hours to produce the $45 million you owe. Therefore, we are legally seizing all collateral associated with the business. DeAndre looked up, his face slick with sweat. He looked like a man standing on the gallows staring at the hangman. You are taking the house, he whispered, his voice cracking. I am taking everything, I replied coldly. The house, the company bank accounts, the investment properties, everything you put up as collateral to secure your fraudulent loans now belongs to me. I am heavily liquidating your fake empire to recover my corporate funds. You are going to walk out of this house with nothing but the expensive clothes on your backs. The guests were completely silent, trapped in a state of absolute shock. They were witnessing a brutal, flawless corporate execution disguised as a family graduation party. They looked at me with a mixture of deep fear and intense awe. The young woman they had dismissed as a stained, embarrassing outcast had just systematically dismantled a prominent Potomac family with terrifying surgical precision. I turned my gaze away from my broken parents and looked up at the grand staircase. Trevon was still standing there, clutching the keys to the leased Ferrari. He had been completely silent during the entire exposure, watching his parents' fake empire burn to the ground. He looked terrified, but I could see the desperate wheels turning in his arrogant mind. He still thought he had an out. He still thought he was the golden child, the Stanford-educated prodigy who could somehow charm his way out of this total disaster. He still thought he possessed some inherent value that elevated him above the wreckage. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the bottom of the staircase, locking eyes with my arrogant brother. I had torn down the foundation of the house, but the golden idol still needed to be completely shattered. The first hammer strike had demolished my parents, but the second hammer strike was reserved entirely for him. The first hammer strike had demolished my parents, but the second hammer strike was reserved entirely for him. Trevon gripped the polished wooden banister of the grand staircase, his knuckles turning stark white against his dark skin. The initial shock that had frozen his perfectly handsome features slowly morphed into a desperate, frantic rage. He could not accept that the useless sister he had mocked his entire life was now the architect of his family's financial destruction. He threw his shoulders back, puffing out his chest in a pathetic attempt to project the authority he had never actually earned. "You are completely bluffing!" Trevon shouted, his voice echoing shrilly across the marble foyer, cracking under the immense pressure. "You cannot just walk in here with your hired thugs and declare yourself the owner of everything. I do not care what fake forged documents your actors brought to this party. I am a Stanford graduate. I am a highly educated legal scholar. I know the corporate law better than some basement coder. If you try to lay a single finger on my properties or my assets, I will personally sue you for everything you are worth. I will drag you through civil court until you are begging for mercy on your knees." I took 2 aggressive steps down the stairs, waving the keys to the leased Ferrari like a weapon. "You are just jealous, Kendra. You have always been insanely jealous of my intellect and my undeniable success. You could not cut it in a real university, so you resent the fact that I graduated with top honors. You want to ruin my celebration because you know you will never ever be on my level. The sheer audacity of his delusion was absolutely staggering. He was standing in the smoking ruins of a bankrupt empire, looking directly at the billionaire who had bought his father's debt, and he still believed he held the higher ground. He still believed the golden child narrative his parents had violently brainwashed into him since birth. I thought his fabricated academic prestige was a magic shield that could somehow deflect reality. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic, chaotic energy. I simply looked at him with an expression of profound clinical pity. I turned my head slightly and gave Elias a subtle, commanding nod. Elias stepped forward instantly. The seasoned corporate lawyer did not look amused or angry. He looked entirely bored, like a man forced to exterminate a particularly annoying pest. He unlatched the second compartment of his heavy metal briefcase. He did not pull out bank statements this time. He pulled out a single thick manila folder bearing the official, unmistakable embossed seal of Stanford University. Instead of handing the folder to Trevin or my parents, Elias walked directly toward the prominent local judge who had been laughing with my father earlier in the evening. The judge, a man widely known for his strict adherence to facts and evidence, looked at the folder with wide, cautious eyes. "Your Honor," Elias said, his voice carrying an icy professional clarity that demanded absolute attention from every single guest. "As an impartial officer of the court, would you be so kind as to read the highlighted section of the official academic transcript contained within this folder? It was obtained legally through a deep, intensive background check during our corporate acquisition due diligence process." The judge hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking the folder. He adjusted his gold-rimmed reading glasses and opened the heavy cover. The entire room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. Even Trayvon stopped his arrogant posturing. A sudden deep uncertainty flickered across his face. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously between Elias and the judge. The judge cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the dense academic text. When he finally spoke, his voice was loud and clear, echoing terribly through the extravagant mansion, leaving absolutely no room for misinterpretation. "This is an official registrar document from Stanford University," the judge announced, looking up at the crowd before returning his gaze to the paper. "It states here clearly that Trevon DeAndre Washington was formally and permanently expelled from the university exactly 18 months ago. The disciplinary board cites multiple severe violations of the academic honor code, including the purchasing of term papers, widespread blatant plagiarism, and attempting to financially bribe a teaching assistant." The collective gasp from the high society crowd was absolutely deafening. The prestigious doctors and lawyers stared at Trayvon in pure, unfiltered disgust. In their elite, highly competitive circles, academic fraud was the ultimate unforgivable sin. It was a complete betrayal of the very foundation of their societal standing. Furthermore, the judge continued, his tone turning noticeably colder and more rigid. The transcript explicitly states that no degree, honorary or otherwise, was ever conferred. The student was escorted off campus by university security and permanently banned from future enrollment. Brianna, standing near the bottom of the stairs, whipped her head around to stare at her fiancé. Her jaw actually dropped open in horror. The calculating, gold-digging opportunist realized in a split second that she had tethered her entire future to a man who did not even possess a basic undergraduate degree. Valerie let out another theatrical wail from the floor, but it sounded weak, completely drained of its previous manipulative power. She could not deny the official university seal or the judge's objective reading. The beautiful, perfect narrative she had bragged about to her country club friends was entirely dead. Trevon looked as though all the blood had been instantly drained from his body. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some pathetic, carefully constructed excuse, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He stood frozen, paralyzed by the brilliant spotlight of truth exposing his lies. "You did not graduate with honors," Trevon, I stated, stepping closer to the staircase so he was forced to look directly down into my eyes. "You were thrown out like trash because you thought you could buy your way through life without doing a single ounce of actual work. But the academic fraud is not even the worst part, is it?" Trevin began to shake uncontrollably. The keys to the leased Ferrari rattled audibly in his trembling hand. He took a hesitant step backward, physically retreating from the crushing weight of the truth I was about to unleash. You needed a way to maintain your wealthy, arrogant lifestyle after you were kicked out of your dorm. I continued projecting my voice, so the guests hanging on my every word caught every devastating detail. You needed raw cash to keep pretending you were a brilliant prodigy living the high life in California. So you turned to the absolute worst possible solution. You started day trading high-risk cryptocurrency using highly leveraged offshore accounts. My father, still slumped in his velvet chair, lifted his head weakly. His eyes widened in horrific realization. He clearly knew absolutely nothing about this development. You are not a financial genius, Trevon, I said, twisting the psychological knife with absolute precision. You are an amateur gambler with a severe destructive addiction. You lost every single trade. You took out massive underground loans from extremely dangerous unregulated lenders to cover your initial staggering losses, and then you lost all of that too. As of yesterday morning, you have accumulated exactly $500,000 in illicit cryptocurrency debt. You owe money to syndicates that do not send collection letters, they send enforcers. The number echoed through the grand foyer like a thunderclap. $500,000 in toxic, dangerous underground debt. Where did you think the money to keep those lenders at bay came from? I demanded, pointing a rigid finger at my mother, who was weeping pathetically on the marble floor. Mom and Dad did not use my $300,000 trust fund to pay for your prestigious Stanford tuition. They stole my future to pay off your pathetic gambling debts. They drained my grandmother's carefully preserved legacy to keep your kneecaps from being broken by offshore loan sharks. They sacrificed my entire livelihood so you could keep playing pretend. The devastating reality of his entire existence finally crashed down upon Trevon's shoulders. He was not a conqueror. He was not a king. He was a parasitic fraud who had actively drained his own family into total bankruptcy just to maintain a hollow, miserable illusion. He had literally consumed my stolen trust fund just to survive his own staggering stupidity and monumental arrogance. The heavy, customized Ferrari keys slipped from his trembling, sweaty fingers. They hit the marble stairs with a sharp, pathetic clatter, bouncing down the polished steps until they came to rest near my feet. The physical symbol of his fake success lay completely abandoned on the floor, stripped of all its power. Trevon's knees buckled entirely. He did not stumble gracefully. He collapsed backward, his body dropping heavily onto the carpeted landing of the grand staircase. He fell into a velvet accent chair, his body practically folding in half. His custom-tailored suit suddenly looked far too large for him, hanging off his frame like expensive clothes draped over a broken, forgotten mannequin. His face was completely ashen, devoid of any color, making his dark skin look sickly and gray. He stared blankly at the far wall, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. The arrogant, loud, booming golden child had been completely eradicated from existence. In his place sat a terrified, drowning boy who had just realized that the massive dark ocean he was sinking into had absolutely no bottom. The high society guests watched him with pure, unadulterated contempt. There was no pity left in the room. There was no sympathy for a boy who had burned his family's future to fund his gambling addiction. There was only the harsh, unforgiving judgment of a community that absolutely despised liars and frauds. The golden child facade had been meticulously and entirely destroyed. Every lie, every theft, every single arrogant boast had been violently ripped away, leaving nothing but the pathetic, ugly truth exposed to the blinding light. The second hammer had struck with flawless, lethal accuracy, and there was still one more massive blow left to deliver. The heavy, suffocating silence inside the grand foyer was suddenly broken by a deep, unnatural vibration. It started as a low, guttural hum that seemed to rattle the crystal droplets on the chandeliers and vibrate through the polished marble floors beneath our feet. The sound grew steadily louder, shifting from a distant rumble into the aggressive, unmistakable roar of heavy industrial diesel engines. The wealthy guests who had been staring at my collapsed brother and weeping mother instantly turned their attention toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the front of the mansion. The sheer white drapes had already been pulled back to showcase the Ferrari, but now they framed a completely different spectacle. The elite crowd surged forward, pressing themselves against the glass, their eyes widening in collective disbelief. I did not need to look out the window to know what was happening. I had personally authorized the dispatch orders just 2 hours prior. Crawling up the pristine manicured cobblestone driveway of the Potomac estate were three massive heavy-duty flatbed tow trucks. Their bright yellow hazard lights flashed rhythmically, cutting through the warm summer evening and casting harsh rotating shadows across the impeccably landscaped lawn. They moved with a slow, predatory deliberation, completely ignoring the luxury Mercedes and Porsches lining the street. The trucks were not there to deliver more imported champagne or high-end catering equipment. They were there to perform a brutal mechanical extraction. The lead truck backed up with a loud, piercing beep that shattered whatever remaining dignity my parents had desperately tried to cling to. It maneuvered aggressively, positioning its heavy steel ramp directly in front of the gleaming metallic red Ferrari SF 980 Straight-Ale. The massive white ribbon tied to the roof of the hypercar fluttered in the exhaust fumes, looking instantly absurd and pathetic. Two men jumped out of the lead truck. They were not wearing tailored suits or serving caviar. They were burly, no-nonsense repossession agents wearing heavy canvas work jackets, thick leather gloves, and steel-toed boots. They moved with the brisk, unbothered efficiency of blue-collar workers who did not care about high society aesthetics or bruised billionaire egos. They were simply there to do a job and retrieve stolen property. The head agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick beard, walked directly up to the front doors of the mansion. He did not bother knocking. He pushed the heavy mahogany doors open, letting the humid night air and the overwhelming smell of diesel exhaust flood into the elegant foyer. He held a thick metal clipboard in his hands, his eyes scanning the crowd of horrified socialites before landing on my father. DeAndre Washington, the agent, called out, his rough voice easily cutting through the remaining murmurs of the crowd. We have a court-ordered mandate to secure and retrieve multiple assets on this property, including the 2024 Ferrari SF90 and several pieces of high-end rented furniture currently inside this residence. Step aside and let my men work, or we will involve the local authorities immediately. My father remained frozen in his velvet chair, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the public execution taking place. He could not move. He could not speak. He could only watch as the two repo men walked right past the shocked guests, completely ignoring their designer gowns and expensive suits, and marched straight toward the luxury vehicles outside. The guests began whispering again, but this time their voices were sharp with absolute disgust. They turned to me, demanding an explanation with their eyes. I happily obliged. I took a few steps toward the center of the room, ensuring my voice projected clearly over the mechanical sounds of the tow trucks operating just outside the glass. "That car is not a graduation gift," I announced, gesturing toward the window where the agents were already unspooling heavy, thick steel chains. "That car does not belong to Trevon, and it certainly does not belong to my father. DeAndre did not buy a $500,000 Ferrari. He does not have the credit score to finance a used Honda." I turned my gaze directly onto my father, forcing him to hear his own crimes broadcast to the people he wanted to impress the most. "You knew the bank was preparing to freeze your remaining operational accounts," I stated coldly, dissecting his fraud piece by piece. "You knew Horizon Holdings was auditing your books and closing in on your massive debt. You knew you had absolutely nothing left to your name. But your narcissistic obsession with this fake image of black excellence was so deeply ingrained that you simply could not let it go. You had to have your grand finale. You had to have your perfect social media moment." I pointed a rigid finger at the gleaming sports car outside. "So you committed one final act of absolute brazen corporate theft. You illegally embezzled the last $70,000 from your company payroll account. You literally stole the wages of your own administrative staff, your contractors, and your janitorial crew. And you used their stolen livelihoods to secure a fraudulent 48-hour luxury rental lease." The prominent local judge who had read Trevon's fake transcripts earlier shook his head in pure repulsion. The socialites covered their mouths, horrified by the sheer blatant criminality of the act. "You rented a prop," I continued, my voice echoing with unrelenting authority. "You stole money from innocent working-class people, just so your fake Stanford graduate son could take a few pictures for his Instagram followers. You jeopardized your own freedom for a massive white ribbon and a few hours of fake applause. You sacrificed everything real in your life for a momentary illusion." And the lakefront mansion in Tahoe. I added, turning my attention to the embossed leather folder Trevon had dropped on the stairs. I picked it up and opened it, pulling out the supposed deed. I held the document up for the crowd to see, then calmly ripped it cleanly in half, letting the pieces flutter down onto the marble floor. That is nothing but a forged piece of paper printed from a free online template. The Tahoe house is a weekend rental booked on a stolen credit card. There is no real estate empire to hand over. There is no legacy. There is only a mountain of debt and a string of federal felonies waiting to be prosecuted. Outside, the loud, aggressive clanking of heavy metal chains echoed through the open front doors. The repo men had dropped to the ground, sliding the thick steel hooks securely around the reinforced axles of the Ferrari. The metallic grinding noise was sharp and violent, a harsh industrial soundtrack to the absolute destruction of my father's carefully crafted reality. The sound seemed to finally snap DeAndre out of his catatonic state. The physical realization that the ultimate symbol of his fake wealth was being literally dragged away from his front door triggered a massive, frantic panic attack. His fragile ego could not process the overwhelming public humiliation. He scrambled up from the velvet chair, his polished leather shoes slipping awkwardly against the floor. He lunged toward the open front doors, entirely abandoning any remaining shred of his dignified patriarchal persona. "Stop!" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure, desperate hysteria. "Stop what you are doing right now. You cannot take that car. You are ruining everything. Put those chains down immediately." DeAndre sprinted out onto the cobblestone driveway, his expensive velvet dinner jacket flapping wildly behind him. He ran directly toward the massive yellow tow truck, throwing himself recklessly between the repo men and the red sports car. The high society guests crowded around the large windows, watching the neighborhood patriarch absolutely lose his mind. "You do not understand," DeAndre begged, frantically grabbing the arm of the lead repo agent. "I just need it for a few more hours. Just let the party finish. I will get you the money tomorrow. I swear on my life I will wire you the funds first thing in the morning. Just leave the car in the driveway until the guests go home. Please, I am begging you. Do not embarrass me like this." The lead agent simply shoved my father's hand away with a look of intense annoyance. "Back off, buddy," the agent growled, stepping around DeAndre to check the tension on the heavy steel cables. "Your account is flagged for severe fraud, and the vehicle has been reported as stolen property by the leasing agency. If you touch my equipment again, I am calling the police and having you arrested for interfering with a lawful repossession. Get out of the way before you get hurt." DeAndre realized the agent was completely immune to his charms and his desperate pleas. The reality of his absolute powerlessness finally crushed whatever fight he had left in him. Right there in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, in full view of the wealthy doctors, powerful lawyers, and elite socialites who had respected him for decades, DeAndre Washington completely broke down. He fell heavily to his knees on the hard, rough cobblestone driveway. The sharp impact tore the fabric of his expensive tailored trousers, but he did not care. He clasped his hands together, holding them up toward the indifferent working-class repo agent, tears streaming freely down his face. He sobbed loudly, openly weeping like a terrified child. "Please," DeAndre wailed, his voice echoing pathetically across the manicured lawns of the wealthy Potomac neighborhood. "Please do not do this to me. It is all I have left. They are all watching. They are all watching me. You are taking my legacy. Please just give me one more day." It was the most pathetic, humiliating display I had ever witnessed in my entire life. The man who had terrorized me throughout my childhood, the man who had called me a useless failure and demanded I pay a catering bill just minutes ago, was now sobbing on his knees in the dirt, begging a tow truck driver to leave a rented car so he could maintain his fake billionaire aesthetic. The repo agent ignored him entirely. He signaled to the driver in the truck cabin, and a loud hydraulic whine filled the air. The heavy steel cables tightened, pulling taut against the chassis of the Ferrari. Slowly, brutally, the beautiful red sports car was dragged forward, its tires screeching slightly against the cobblestone. It was pulled forcefully up the steep metal ramp of the flatbed truck. The massive, obnoxious white ribbon tore loose, fluttering down to land in a muddy puddle near DeAndre's knees. I stood inside the mansion, watching the scene unfold, with an expression of pure, icy detachment. I felt absolutely no pity for the man sobbing in the driveway. He had built his own gallows. He had tied his own noose. I had simply arrived to pull the lever. The guests turned away from the windows, physically sickened by the pathetic display of raw, unfiltered desperation. The illusion was completely shattered. The golden child was exposed as a fraudulent failure. The wealthy patriarch was exposed as a desperate thieving criminal. The empire was officially dead, and the rotting corpse was being dragged away on the back of a yellow flatbed truck. But the destruction of my toxic family was not quite complete. There was still one vital member of their inner circle who had yet to reveal her true colors. I turned my gaze away from the window and looked directly at Brianna, knowing that a gold digger operates strictly on survival instincts, and she had just realized the gold mine she was digging in was entirely empty. Brianna did not look at my mother sobbing outside. She did not look at the empty driveway where the Ferrari had been parked. Her eyes were locked entirely on Trayvon. The handsome, charming Stanford graduate she thought she was marrying had just evaporated into thin air. In his place sat a terrified broke fraud who was $500,000 in debt to dangerous underground criminals. Brianna was a woman who traded strictly on her looks and her social proximity. She realized instantly that being associated with Trayvon was no longer a golden ticket to the upper echelon of the elite class. It was a direct one-way ticket to social suicide and severe financial ruin. She had to sever the connection immediately, and she had to do it as loudly and publicly as possible to prove to the remaining wealthy guests that she was also a victim of his massive deception. Trevin looked up from the velvet chair on the staircase landing. He saw the lethal calculation hardening in his fiancée's eyes. He reached a trembling hand out toward her. "Brianna, baby," he pleaded, his voice barely a whisper echoing pathetically in the large room. "Please do not look at me like that. We can fix this. I have a plan. I know guys who can turn this around. We just need a little more time to move some money." The sound of his pathetic whining voice was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Brianna let out a sound that was half scream and half feral growl. She marched up the first 3 steps of the marble staircase, her designer heels clicking like aggressive gunshots against the stone. She stood over him, looking down with an expression of pure, absolute revulsion. "Do not you dare call me baby, you broke, pathetic loser," Brianna shouted at the top of her lungs. Her voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling, cutting sharply through the stunned silence of the room. "You have a plan. You do not even have a college degree. You have been lying to me for 2 solid years. You looked me in the eye every single day and told me you were building a massive real estate empire. You told me we were going to live in a luxury mansion in Tahoe. You told me we were going to be the ultimate power couple in Potomac." She pointed an aggressive manicured finger directly at his face, her chest heaving with rage. "You are a fraud, Trayvon. You are a completely hollow fake. You stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from your own sister just so you could pretend to be a big shot in front of your wealthy friends. You gambled it all away on fake internet money. You are $500,000 in debt to violent loan sharks. You do not have a single dime to your name. You do not even own the custom suit you are wearing right now. It was probably rented with a stolen credit card, just like that sports car outside." Trevin shrank back against the heavy wooden chair, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Brianna, please stop yelling," he begged, looking frantically around at the crowd of elite guests who were hanging on every single word. "Everyone is staring at us. Keep your voice down. We can talk about this in private." "Private?" Brianna shrieked, throwing her hands up in the air in theatrical disgust. "You want to be private now? You have spent our entire relationship showing off in public. You made sure everyone saw you handing the valet a $100 bill you probably stole from your mother's purse. You made sure everyone saw the fake luxury vacations you booked with stolen money. You loved the audience when they were clapping for you. Well, let them watch this." Brianna looked down at her left hand. The massive diamond engagement ring sparkled brightly under the crystal chandeliers. For 2 years, she had flaunted that ring at every country club brunch and high society gala, boasting about its clarity and incredible carat weight. Now she looked at the heavy stone as if it were a highly contagious disease. She realized with sickening clarity that the diamond was either completely fake or purchased with the very trust fund money Trayvon had brutally stolen from me. The symbol of her wealthy future was actually a piece of stolen criminal evidence. She grabbed the ring with her right hand and yanked it violently. Her fingers were slightly swollen from the humid summer heat, and the thick metal band resisted her pull. She let out an angry, frustrated grunt, pulling harder, ignoring the bright red scrape forming rapidly over her knuckle. With a sharp, aggressive tug, the ring finally broke free. She held it up between her thumb and forefinger, displaying the fraudulent jewelry to the entire room. "I wasted 2 years of my prime on you," Brianna screamed, her face flushed with furious indignation. "I turned down actual successful men to stand by your side because I believed your pathetic, elaborate lies. I thought I was marrying a king, but I was just playing house with a broke, desperately stupid little boy. I am not going down with this sinking ship. I am not spending the rest of my life dodging your loan sharks and pretending to be rich in some rented studio apartment." She wound her arm back like a professional baseball pitcher and threw the heavy diamond ring directly at his face. She did not hold back a single ounce of her fury. The metal band flew through the air with terrifying speed. Trevon threw his hands up to protect his face, but he was entirely too slow. The heavy ring struck him squarely in the center of his forehead with a sharp, painful smack. Trevon cried out in pain, clutching his forehead as a small, angry red welt instantly began to form. The ring ricocheted off his skull and hit the marble stairs with a loud, distinct clatter, bouncing down the polished steps until it came to rest right next to the discarded keys of the repossessed Ferrari. The physical symbols of his entire fake existence were now gathered together in a pathetic pile on the floor. Brianna did not wait to see if he was bleeding. She turned on her heel, her expensive dress whipping around her legs, and stormed aggressively down the stairs. She marched toward the heavy mahogany front doors, moving with the frantic, urgent energy of a woman escaping a burning building. She did not look back at Trevon. She did not look at me. She only cared about saving herself from the impending collateral damage. Valerie, having just stumbled back into the foyer from the dirt driveway, tried to intercept her. The disgraced matriarch was covered in dust from her knees to the hem of her expensive gown. "Brianna, please wait," Valerie sobbed, reaching out a trembling hand to grab her future daughter-in-law's arm. "Do not leave him. He needs you right now. We are family. We can get through this terrible crisis together." Brianna slapped Valerie's hand away with brutal, unhesitating force. "Do not touch me, you crazy, delusional thief." Brianna spat, looking at my mother with pure, unadulterated disgust. "We are not family. You are a common criminal who steals from her own daughter to fund a fake lifestyle. I am completely done with you, and I am completely done with your pathetic loser of a son. Have fun explaining this spectacular mess to your fancy friends." With that final, devastating remark, Brianna shoved her way past the two massive security guards who had flanked Elias. She pushed through the heavy wooden doors and marched out into the humid night air, disappearing down the pristine cobblestone driveway, leaving the Washington family in absolute ruins. The explosive departure of the gold digger was the final catalyst needed to completely obliterate the polite high society facade of the room. The wealthy elite guests, who had been standing in shocked silence, suddenly sprang into frantic, coordinated action. The horrific reality of the situation had fully set in. They were standing in a house owned by an anonymous corporate entity. They had just toasted a man exposed as an academic fraud and a degenerate gambler. They had eaten caviar funded by a stolen trust fund. And they had watched the patriarch of the family drop to his knees and beg a repo man to leave a stolen car. This was not just a minor social embarrassment. This was a massive radioactive scandal. Being associated with the Washington family was now a permanent, highly toxic stain on their own carefully guarded reputations. Dozens of smartphones were instantly pulled from expensive designer pockets and crystal-encrusted clutches. The bright flashes of phone cameras illuminated the grand foyer like a nightclub strobe light. Wealthy socialites were blatantly recording Trevon crying on the stairs and Valerie weeping in the dirt-covered entryway. They were snapping photos of the abandoned engagement ring and the discarded Ferrari keys. They were rapidly sending aggressive text messages to their private neighborhood group chats, warning their friends about the staggering fraud they had just witnessed. The prominent local judge, the man who had read the Stanford transcripts aloud, buttoned his suit jacket with a look of severe, uncompromising disdain. He walked deliberately toward the center of the room, ensuring my parents saw his imminent departure. DeAndre had just stumbled back inside, leaning heavily against the doorframe, looking like a hollowed-out ghost. "You are an absolute disgrace to this community." DeAndre, the judge, said, his voice ringing with cold, objective authority. "I trusted you with my personal investments. I vouched for your character at the country club. You are nothing but a common thief hiding behind a velvet jacket. Expect a call from my legal team first thing Monday morning. I am pulling every single asset I have tied to your fraudulent firm." The judge did not wait for a response. He turned and walked out the door, signaling the beginning of a massive, unapologetic exodus. The dam had completely broken. The elite guests surged toward the exit, moving with a desperate, frantic urgency. They did not stop to say goodbye. They did not offer a single word of comfort to the weeping mother or the devastated son. They practically trampled over each other to escape the toxic fallout of the Washington family. Women in expensive gowns hiked up their skirts to walk faster down the driveway, desperate to reach their luxury vehicles. Men in tailored suits aggressively dialed their financial managers, barking loud, frantic orders to sever all business ties with my father's company immediately. I watched them leave, observing the brutal efficiency of high society self-preservation. In less than 3 minutes, the massive grand living room had emptied entirely. The dozens of powerful, influential people who had filled the house with laughter and fake admiration were completely gone. The driveway outside was a chaotic mess of headlights and screeching tires as the guests fled the scene of the social crime. The catering staff, sensing the absolute finality of the situation, moved with incredible speed. The head caterer, who was still holding the black leather folder, signaled his team. Waiters efficiently packed up the remaining silver trays of food. Bartenders aggressively dismantled the premium open bar, shoving unopened bottles of vintage champagne back into padded transport crates. They did not care about presentation or politeness anymore. They just wanted to clear their expensive equipment out of a foreclosed home before the authorities arrived. Within 10 minutes, the caterers had completely stripped the room of its lavish decorations. They wheeled massive carts out the back service entrance, leaving behind a stark, empty shell. The towering crystal vases were gone. The silver platters were gone. The smooth, elegant jazz music had been replaced by a heavy, deafening silence. The social standing my parents had spent decades brutally clawing their way toward, the reputation they had sacrificed my entire childhood to build, was completely, utterly, and permanently obliterated. It took 30 years to construct their fragile illusion of black excellence, but it took exactly 30 minutes to burn it entirely to the ground. The vast empty space left behind by the fleeing elite guests and the efficient catering staff felt like a cavernous tomb. The Grand Potomac mansion, which had been pulsating with arrogant laughter and clinking crystal just an hour prior, now echoed only with the sound of my mother's ragged, panicked breathing. The extravagant floral arrangements were gone. The premium open bar was gone. The fake friends were gone. All that remained was the bare marble floor and the shattered fragments of my family's completely fabricated reality. Valerie was still kneeling in the entryway, dirt smeared across the hem of her expensive designer gown. She looked around the stripped foyer, her eyes darting frantically from the empty driveway to the blank walls. She was desperately searching for an escape hatch, a loophole, a way to salvage her obliterated social standing. Then her wide, manic eyes locked onto me. I watched the realization hit her like a physical shockwave. The gears in her desperate, narcissistic mind spun wildly, shifting from absolute terror to a sickening, calculated opportunism. She was looking at the daughter she had mocked and humiliated her entire life, but she was no longer seeing a failure. She was seeing a human bank account. She was looking at an $800 million lifeline standing right in her own foyer. The transformation was horrifying to witness. The vicious, sneering monster who had ordered me to hide in the kitchen completely vanished. In her place emerged a frantic, weeping caricature of a loving, devoted mother. Valerie dragged herself across the polished marble floor, crawling on her hands and knees, ignoring the physical indignity of the act. She scrambled toward me, her face contorted into an expression of desperate, manufactured maternal warmth. "Kendra, my beautiful, brilliant Kendra!" Valerie cried out, her voice dripping with thick, syrupy manipulation. She reached out with trembling hands, grabbing the fabric of my ruined silk dress. Her perfectly manicured fingers dug into the material, clinging to me like a drowning woman clutching a life raft. "I knew it," she sobbed, looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "I always knew you were destined for absolute greatness. We knew you had this incredible genius inside of you." I looked down at her, feeling a wave of pure clinical disgust. She was actually trying to rewrite 30 years of psychological abuse in real time. She was attempting to gaslight me into believing her cruelty was some kind of elaborate master plan. "We did it to push you, Kendra." Valerie wailed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her flawless makeup. "Do you not see it now? We had to be hard on you. We had to break you down so you could build yourself back up. You were always the smart one in the family. We knew you did not need our coddling. We pushed you out of the nest so you could learn how to fly, and look at how high you soared." DeAndre slowly pushed himself up from the velvet chair, his face pale and slick with sweat. He caught on to Valerie's desperate strategy immediately. He stumbled toward us, attempting to arrange his defeated features into a mask of fatherly pride. "Your mother is right, Kendra." DeAndre stammered, his voice weak and trembling. "We gave Trevon the easy path because we knew he was weak. But you were strong. You are a conqueror. You have the true blood of a leader. We can fix all of this tonight. You can merge Horizon Holdings with our firm. We can run the empire together as a family, just like I always dreamed. You have to save us, Kendra. We are your blood." The sheer, staggering audacity of their delusion was breathtaking. They had stolen my future, a fake golden child insulted my career and publicly humiliated me. Yet they still believed they were entitled to my success simply because we shared DNA. They thought they could slap the label of tough love over decades of neglect and automatically gain access to my corporate fortune. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at my mother's hands clutching my dress and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just an overwhelming sense of finality. I physically took a step backward, breaking Valerie's frantic grip. Her hands slipped from the silk fabric, leaving her kneeling awkwardly on the cold marble floor. I looked down at her and delivered the ultimate psychological blow, shattering her desperate illusion permanently. "Blood is biology," I stated, my voice echoing with glacial, unyielding authority. "Family is loyalty." Valerie froze, her fake tears instantly drying up as the freezing temperature of my words washed over her. DeAndre stopped mid-step, his mouth hanging slightly open. "You did not push me to succeed." I continued, dissecting their manipulation with absolute surgical precision. "You pushed me out of your house because my existence threatened your fake aesthetic. You mocked my depression. You called my career choice a joke. You told your country club friends I was a worthless embarrassment. You did not do any of that to make me strong. You did it because it made you feel powerful to crush someone who loved you." I pointed a firm, rigid finger down at my mother. "You did not push me, Valerie. You tried to bury me." I paused, letting the heavy, undeniable truth settle into the quiet room. I looked from my mother to my father and finally to Trevon, who was still slumped on the staircase, listening to his entire golden child identity being verbally dismantled. "But you forgot one very important detail," I concluded, my voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. "You forgot that I was a seed." The metaphor hung in the empty foyer, heavy and absolute. I had taken the dirt they threw on me and used it to grow an empire. They had completely underestimated the very foundation of my character, and now they were suffocating in the shadow of the massive tree I had become. Valerie's mouth opened and closed silently. The frantic, manipulative energy entirely drained from her body. She finally realized that the psychological control she had wielded over me for nearly 3 decades was completely gone. I was immune to her tears. I was immune to her guilt trips. The steel boundary I had just erected was completely impenetrable. However, my personal boundary was not the final consequence they had to face tonight. The emotional reckoning was over, but the legal execution was just beginning. I turned my head and gave Elias another subtle, commanding nod. The sharp, impeccably dressed corporate lawyer stepped forward, instantly moving with the calm, inevitable force of a ticking clock. He did not look at my parents with pity or anger. He looked at them with the detached professionalism of a man sealing a coffin. "Mrs. Washington," Elias began, addressing Valerie directly, his voice cutting sharply through the remaining silence. "Your daughter has established her personal boundaries. Now, as her legal counsel, it is my strict duty to inform you of your immediate legal liabilities. Valerie shrank back, her eyes darting nervously toward the heavy metal briefcases still resting on the dining table. DeAndre nervously wiped the sweat from his forehead, bracing himself for whatever catastrophic news Elias was about to deliver. Earlier this evening, you publicly admitted to draining a $300,000 trust fund established by Kendra grandmother. Elias stated his tone perfectly, even and terrifyingly formal. You claimed it was an investment in your son. You boasted about using those funds to secure Stanford tuition and luxury catering. We were just talking. Valerie stammered, her voice pitching high with renewed panic. I was angry. I was exaggerating. It was just a family dispute. It was a highly detailed confession to a massive federal crime, Elias corrected smoothly. But we did not need your verbal confession tonight. Horizon Holdings employs the most ruthless forensic accountants in the country. Before we executed the debt acquisition, we conducted a comprehensive audit of every single financial move your family has made in the past 5 years. Elias reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek silver flash drive, holding it up between his thumb and forefinger. We tracked every single penny of that $300,000 trust fund, Elias explained. We have the forged authorization documents bearing your signatures. We have the exact IP addresses used to execute the unauthorized wire transfers. We have the routing numbers showing exactly how the stolen funds were illegally funneled into offshore cryptocurrency accounts held by Trevon and disguised lease payments initiated by DeAndre. Trevon let out a loud, pathetic whimper from the staircase, burying his face in his hands. He knew the crypto trail would inevitably lead directly to his massive illegal gambling debts. You committed wire fraud, identity theft, and severe fiduciary embezzlement. Elias continued, systematically outlining their criminal charges. You did not just steal from your daughter. You utilized federal banking networks to execute a coordinated financial crime against a designated beneficiary. DeAndre aggressively grabbed his chest, struggling to breathe. You cannot do this, he gasped, his eyes wide with sheer terror. You cannot send your own parents to prison, Kendra. The scandal will ruin you too. The media will tear our family apart. I am not doing anything, DeAndre. I replied, my voice completely detached. I am simply allowing the legal system to process the criminal choices you made. I did not forge the signatures. I did not steal the money. You built this trap entirely by yourself. Elias stepped closer to my father, delivering the final lethal blow. Horizon Holdings has a strict legal obligation to report any discovered financial crimes during a corporate acquisition. Elias stated, his voice absolutely devoid of mercy. Therefore, our legal team compiled the forged documents, the wire transfer logs, and the forensic accounting reports into a comprehensive digital dossier. Elias lowered the silver flash drive, slipping it back into his tailored pocket. Those logs and reports were formally handed over to the federal authorities at exactly 9 o'clock this morning. The words struck my parents like a physical explosion. The federal authorities. It was not a civil dispute. It was not a threat of future litigation. The evidence was already sitting on a federal prosecutor's desk. The investigation was already active. The warrants were likely already being drafted. Valerie let out a sound that was barely human, a horrific, gut-wrenching scream of pure, unadulterated panic. She threw herself onto the marble floor, scratching at the polished stone, completely losing her mind. DeAndre fell backward, knocking a heavy wooden chair over, grabbing his thinning hair in absolute frantic despair. Prison was no longer a distant theoretical threat. It was an immediate, looming certainty. They had spent their entire lives terrified of losing their social status in Potomac. Now they were going to lose their freedom, their assets, and their names entirely. The federal government was coming to dismantle whatever small, pathetic pieces of their lives Horizon Holdings had left behind. I stood in the center of the foyer, watching them completely break apart. The grandiose mansion was dead quiet, except for the sounds of my mother's hysterical sobbing and my father's panicked breathing. The golden child illusion was shattered. The financial empire was liquidated. The legal trap was permanently snapped shut. The reckoning was absolutely flawless and complete. The reckoning was absolutely flawless and complete. The suffocating atmosphere that had choked this Potomac mansion for decades was entirely gone. I stood in the center of the devastated foyer, breathing in the crisp night air that drifted through the open mahogany doors. I felt a profound, undeniable sense of weightlessness. The chains of generational trauma had been completely severed. "Excuse me, Madam CEO." The voice was incredibly hesitant and careful. I turned to see the head caterer standing a few feet away. He had remained entirely silent during the brutal dismantling of the Washington family empire, but he still had a professional duty to fulfill. His staff had already stripped the dining room of its silver trays and loaded the remaining vintage champagne into their refrigerated trucks. He held the black leather folder tightly against his chest, his eyes darting nervously between Elias and the weeping figures of my parents on the floor. "I apologize for interrupting the caterer," said his tone projecting immense respect. "But there is still the matter of the outstanding invoice. You mentioned earlier that Horizon Holdings would guarantee the $15,000 payment for tonight's services." Valerie snapped her head up from the cold marble floor. Her tear-streaked face twisted with a sudden desperate flicker of hope. She actually thought I was going to bail them out of this final immediate embarrassment. DeAndre stopped grabbing his thinning hair and looked up, his bloodshot eyes pleading silently. They still fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the transaction occurring in their own foyer. They still believed they could extract one last drop of blood from the daughter they had abused. I did say that I confirmed, keeping my voice perfectly even and utterly detached. Horizon Holdings guarantees that your business will not suffer due to the fraudulent actions of the previous homeowners. I signaled to Elias. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a sleek platinum checkbook bearing the embossed logo of my corporation. He handed it to me along with a heavy silver fountain pen. The caterer stepped forward, opening the black leather folder to present the final itemized bill. Valerie scrambled slightly, pulling herself up onto her knees. "Oh, Kendra," she gasped, a sickeningly sweet tone of gratitude forcing its way through her hysterical sobs. "Thank you. Thank you so much. I knew you would not let us face criminal charges for theft of services. You are doing the right thing. We can still be a family." I did not even glance in her direction. I completely ignored her desperate, pathetic performance. I uncapped the heavy silver pen and pressed the nib against the crisp paper of the corporate check. I wrote out the current date with smooth, deliberate strokes. I moved to the payee line and wrote the name of the elite catering company. Then I moved to the payment amount box. I did not write 15,000. I drew a large, perfect, unyielding zero. I moved to the written amount line and carefully spelled out the word zero. I signed my name at the bottom, adding my official corporate title with a sharp, aggressive flourish. I tore the check from the book, blew on the ink for a fraction of a second, and placed it squarely into the black leather folder. The caterer looked down at the check. His professional composure cracked slightly. He blinked rapidly, staring at the single digit as if his eyes were deceiving him. "Madam CEO," he stammered, looking up at me in utter confusion. "This check is written for $0. The balance is 15,000. I capped the silver pen and handed it back to Elias. I met the caterer's confused gaze with absolute terrifying clarity. "That is exactly right," I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the vaulted ceiling. "You presented an invoice for a party celebrating an academic fraud hosted by a man currently under federal investigation for massive commercial bank embezzlement. I am the chief executive officer of the private equity firm that just foreclosed on this property. I do not pay for parties I was not invited to." I pointed a rigid, commanding finger directly at DeAndre, who was still slumped on the floor staring at me in absolute horror. "Bill the man on the floor," I instructed the caterer, my tone completely devoid of mercy. "He is the one who signed your contract. He is the one who fraudulently ordered your premium services. Horizon Holdings guarantees your payment because our legal department will represent your catering firm pro bono in civil court. We will add your $15,000 invoice to the massive pile of federal restitution claims currently being filed against DeAndre Washington. You will get every single penny you are owed out of his impending prison commissary account or whatever liquid assets the government seizes." The caterer snapped the black leather folder shut. A look of profound understanding washed over his face. He recognized a flawless legal maneuver when he saw one. He bowed his head respectfully. "Understood, Madam CEO," he replied, taking a step backward. Thank you for your business. We will expect to hear from your legal department on Monday morning. He turned on his heel and marched out the front doors, signaling his remaining staff to evacuate the premises immediately. Valerie let out a sound that resembled a dying animal. It was a guttural, horrific shriek of pure, unadulterated defeat. She slammed her fists against the marble floor, shattering her expensive acrylic nails. "You monster!" she screamed, her face contorted with violent rage. "You absolute monster! You planned this. You wanted to see us completely destroyed." I simply looked down at her. "I did not need to plan anything, Mom," I said softly. "I just stopped hiding the matches while you poured the gasoline." Suddenly, a new sound pierced the heavy, humid air of the Potomac night. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail echoing from the distant highway. Within seconds, the sound multiplied, growing rapidly louder and more aggressive. It was the distinct, urgent howl of multiple police sirens approaching the neighborhood at high speed. DeAndre scrambled backward, pushing himself away from the dining table until his back hit the grand staircase. He looked wildly at the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The flashing reflection of bright red and blue lights began to dance across the glass, throwing chaotic, spinning shadows over the ruined foyer. "The federal authorities do not send local patrol cars for white-collar corporate fraud," Elias noted, calmly adjusting his silk tie. "They send specialized tactical units. The local police arriving now are likely responding to the caterer's urgent dispatch regarding the theft of services and the fraudulent credit cards used to secure the luxury vehicle rentals. The federal agents will arrive shortly after to secure the corporate hard drives." Trevin finally moved. The fake golden child scrambled up the stairs, tripping over his expensive leather shoes. He grabbed the wooden banister, hauling himself up in a state of absolute blind panic. "I cannot go to jail," Trevon babbled, his voice pitching hysterically. "I have underground debt. They will kill me in there. Mom, do something. Tell them I did not know about the money." He was willing to throw his own mother directly under the bus to save himself. It was the ultimate poetic conclusion to the golden child dynamic. He turned and sprinted down the upstairs hallway, desperately looking for a place to hide in a mansion he no longer owned. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the front of the house, painting DeAndre's terrified face in harsh, alternating colors. The sound of heavy car doors slamming shut echoed from the cobblestone driveway. Loud, authoritative voices barked orders outside, demanding the perimeter be secured. "Kendra, please," my father begged, his voice completely breaking. He reached a trembling hand out toward me, his eyes wide with absolute primal fear. "Please tell them it is a misunderstanding. Tell them Horizon Holdings is handling the debts internally. You have the power to stop this. You are a billionaire. Just write a check. Just make them go away. I will do anything you want. I will give you anything." "You have absolutely nothing left to give me, DeAndre," I replied, my voice as cold and hard as a diamond. "You spent my entire life trying to convince me I was worthless. You spent 30 years building a kingdom of lies and making me the designated peasant. The authorities are outside to collect the toll for your arrogance. It is time to pay the piper." Heavy, aggressive knocks hammered against the open mahogany doors. Police officers in dark tactical uniforms stepped into the grand entryway, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They scanned the chaotic scene, taking in the weeping woman on the floor, the terrified man cowering by the stairs, and the impeccably dressed corporate lawyer standing calmly by my side. DeAndre Washington, one of the lead officers, barked, his voice booming with unquestionable legal authority. "We have multiple felony warrants for your arrest regarding severe wire fraud, grand larceny, and the illicit embezzlement of corporate funds. Stand up and place your hands behind your back immediately." Valerie lunged forward, attempting to grab the officer's leg, screaming incoherently about fake trust funds and jealous daughters. Two other officers swiftly moved in, physically restraining her and pulling her away from her husband. She thrashed and kicked, completely losing the final shreds of her high society dignity. I did not stay to watch them snap the heavy steel handcuffs around my father's wrists. I did not want to watch him cry as they read him his Miranda rights in the middle of his ruined foyer. I had already witnessed the absolute destruction of their psychological empire. The physical arrest was just the boring bureaucratic paperwork. "We are finished here, Elias," I stated, turning my back completely on the screaming, pleading figures of my family. Elias gave a sharp nod, signaling the two massive security guards. They picked up the metal briefcases containing the absolute deed to my new properties. The guards moved forward, clearing a wide path through the chaos, creating a perfect safe corridor for my departure. I walked out of the heavy mahogany doors, stepping out into the cool, refreshing night air. The humidity had broken, leaving the Potomac atmosphere crisp and clear. The sprawling driveway was a chaotic mess of flashing police cruisers and neighborhood security vehicles. The elite neighbors who had fled the party earlier were now standing on their immaculate lawns wearing silk robes and holding glasses of scotch, watching the Washington family downfall broadcast live on their very own street. I ignored all of them. I walked down the stone steps, my ruined silk dress rustling softly against the concrete. Waiting smoothly at the base of the driveway, perfectly illuminated by the flashing police lights, was my actual car. It was not a rusted 10-year-old Honda. It was a sleek midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom. The sheer massive presence of the luxury vehicle commanded absolute respect. The tinted windows hid the luxurious interior, and the iconic silver ornament gleamed proudly on the hood. A uniformed chauffeur immediately stepped forward, opening the heavy rear door with a respectful bow. He did not look at the police cars or the screaming coming from the mansion. He only looked at me. "Good evening, Madam CEO," the chauffeur said, his voice perfectly modulated. "Good evening, Marcus," I replied, stepping smoothly into the plush leather interior of the vehicle. Elias slid into the seat beside me, placing his briefcase carefully on the floorboards. The chauffeur closed the heavy door, sealing us inside a perfect silent sanctuary of absolute wealth and power. The screaming of my mother and the frantic pleading of my father were instantly cut off, completely muted by the thick bulletproof glass of the Rolls-Royce. "Take us back to the city, Marcus," I instructed, leaning back against the incredibly soft headrest. "Right away, Madam CEO." The powerful engine purred to life, completely silent and utterly dominant. The Rolls-Royce glided smoothly forward, navigating effortlessly past the chaotic cluster of police cruisers. We drove out of the massive wrought iron gates of the Potomac neighborhood, leaving the destruction entirely behind us. I looked out the tinted window, watching the flashing red and blue lights fade into the distance. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel a single ounce of regret. I had walked into that house as a scapegoat, and I was driving away as an absolute conqueror. The dark road stretched out ahead of me, winding through the affluent Maryland suburbs toward the glittering skyline of the city. I looked down at my hands resting quietly in my lap. They were not shaking. The frantic anxiety that used to define my entire existence whenever I interacted with my family had been completely permanently excised from my soul. Elias opened a compartment in the center console and poured 2 glasses of sparkling water, handing one to me. "A flawless execution," he noted calmly, taking a sip. "Horizon Holdings will finalize the liquidation of the physical properties by Tuesday. The federal prosecutors have everything they need for a maximum sentencing recommendation." I took the glass, letting the cold water ground me in the present reality. It is exactly what they earned, Elias. Nothing more and nothing less. The car accelerated smoothly, pushing me gently back into the luxurious leather. The darkness outside the window felt comforting. A blank canvas waiting for me to paint my actual future. I had spent 28 years surviving in a toxic cage built by people who fundamentally despised me. They had demanded my absolute submission and expected me to fund their illusions. Instead, I had bought their cage, stripped it for parts, and locked them inside with their own miserable consequences. The empire of lies was gone, and my real life was finally beginning. 8 months later, the morning sun spilled across the polished oak floors of my penthouse office at Orapay headquarters. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. The view from the 50th floor was breathtaking, a sprawling testament to industry and ambition. It was a sharp, beautiful contrast to the dark, suffocating shadows of the Potomac mansion I had left behind. My office hummed with the quiet, efficient energy of a company processing billions of dollars in daily transactions. I held a steaming mug of black coffee, feeling the warmth seep into my palms. There was no anxiety in my chest anymore. The constant heavy dread that used to define my waking hours had completely vanished, replaced by a profound, unshakable peace. Across the room, a sleek, flat-screen television played the morning financial news at a low volume. I turned my head as a familiar name flashed across the ticker at the bottom of the screen. The news anchor, a polished woman in a sharp red suit, delivered the update with crisp professional detachment. Former Potomac real estate magnate DeAndre Washington was sentenced yesterday to 84 months in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. She reported, her voice filling the quiet office. Washington pleaded guilty to multiple counts of severe wire fraud and corporate embezzlement, following the dramatic collapse of his investment firm last summer. The screen flashed a courtroom sketch of my father. He looked incredibly small, hunched over a defense table, stripped of his velvet jackets and his booming arrogance. The anchor continued, outlining the absolute ruin left in his wake. In the aftermath of the asset seizure, Washington's wife, Valerie, was forced to declare total personal bankruptcy. Court records indicate she recently relocated to a low-income studio apartment on the outskirts of the city and is currently employed as a night shift janitor for a commercial cleaning service to meet her court-ordered restitution payments. Their son, Trevin Washington, once a prominent fixture in local society columns, was also implicated in a massive offshore cryptocurrency scandal. He is currently working as a gas station cashier, with 70% of his minimum wage earnings being aggressively garnished by federal authorities to repay his illicit debts. I pressed a button on my remote, muting the television. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply took a sip of my coffee and turned back to the window. The universe had balanced its scales. They had built a kingdom on deception and arrogance, and gravity had finally mercilessly pulled them back down to the earth. They were living the exact lives they had earned. The heavy glass doors of my office slid open with a soft mechanical whisper. Elias walked in, looking as sharp and unbothered as the night he helped me dismantle my father's fake empire. He was carrying a thick leather-bound portfolio, but this one did not hold foreclosure notices or eviction mandates. This folder was entirely dedicated to creation. "Good morning, Madam CEO," Elias greeted me, placing the open portfolio meticulously on my large glass desk. "The board of directors has given their unanimous approval. The final endowment documents are ready for your signature." I walked over to the desk and looked down at the crisp legal paper. At the top, printed in bold, elegant letters, was the title, "The Harrington Tech Initiative." It was a $10 million comprehensive scholarship fund named in honor of my late grandmother, the only person in my bloodline who had genuinely believed in my potential. The initiative was specifically designed to fully fund the university education and provide uninhibited seed capital for young, underprivileged African American women entering the fields of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I picked up my heavy silver fountain pen. As I stared at the signature line, I thought about the scared 22-year-old girl who had been thrown out of her home and told she was a useless failure. I thought about the $300,000 trust fund that had been brutally stolen from me to finance a golden child's delusion. I was ensuring that no other brilliant, capable young Black woman would ever have her dreams stolen or her future compromised by the very people supposed to protect her. I pressed the nib of the pen against the paper and signed my name with a smooth, powerful flourish. The ink dried instantly, cementing a legacy built on actual empowerment rather than fake aesthetic. "The press release goes out at noon," Elias stated, closing the folder with a satisfied nod. "You are changing the landscape, Kendra. You are building something that will outlast us all." I smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached my eyes. "That is the whole point, Elias." After Elias left, I walked back to the massive windows, looking down at the bustling city below. For decades, I had been taught that blood was an unbreakable bond, that biological ties required absolute, unconditional loyalty, even in the face of relentless psychological abuse. I had been brainwashed into believing that walking away from my toxic family would make me the villain of the story. But looking out at the empire I had built with my own two hands, I knew the absolute truth. Blood simply makes you related. It is respect, consistency, and mutual care that makes you family. Generational curses do not end by quietly absorbing the pain and hoping your abusers will magically change. Generational curses end when someone finally finds the incredible courage to stand up, say no, and completely sever the infected branch from the family tree. I had to become the villain in their fake narrative so I could become the hero of my own actual reality. I had to let them call me a failure so I could quietly build the foundation of my massive success in the dark. I had to walk away from the people who shared my DNA to find the people who actually shared my values. If you are currently suffocating in a toxic environment, waiting for people who constantly belittle you to suddenly recognize your worth, you have to stop waiting. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. You have to gather your strength, pack your things, and walk out the door. You have to build your own table instead of begging for a crumb from theirs. You have to reclaim your power, validate your own existence, and step boldly into the life you actually deserve. It will be terrifying. It will be incredibly lonely at first. But the peace you will find on the other side is worth absolutely everything. If you have ever had to cut off the people who were supposed to protect you to save yourself, tell me your story in the comments. Subscribe for more.